The scalpel drone had already opened her side before Juno Vashti understood she was awake. She felt it the way you feel a held breath through a wall, pressure without sound. The room narrowed to a single silver point moving under her ribs. Somewhere above her, in a language built for gills as much as throats, an Ondine surgeon was arguing with another about a piece of metal lodged against her spine. Machines she did not recognize sang in 3 overlapping tones. And beneath all of it, so faint she thought at first it was her own pulse, something in her hip began, very softly, to hum back. 3 days earlier she had been 300 meters under the black water of Karstvanter, running a gloved hand along a wall no living thing had touched in 11,000 years. Halyard salvage paid by the manifest, not by the hour, which was the only reason a human diving contractor was down in the flood fortress at all instead of some licensed Ondine survey team with better insurance. Juno had learned to move through drowned precursor architecture, the way other people moved through their own kitchens in the dark, by feel, by memory of 100 similar rooms, by the certainty that nothing down here was going to reach out and take her hand. She had believed that certainty for 4 years. She believed it for exactly 1 more second after her palm found the seam in the wall that wasn't supposed to be there. The pylon didn't explode, it exhaled. A concussive push of water and pressure that folded the gantry above her like wet paper and brought 400 kilos of coral-fused alloy down across her hip and side before she had time to do anything but turn her shoulder into it. She remembered orange emergency light through cracked faceplate glass. She remembered Daishi Akoro's voice on the comm, flattened by panic into something almost calm, telling her to breathe slow, telling her the retrieval sled was 6 minutes out, telling her not to look down at the thing driven through her suit and into the meat below her ribs, silver black and warm in a way metal that old had no right to be. She had looked anyway. Now, on the table, that same warmth was moving under her skin like something remembering how to walk. Foreign mass is fused to the T11 nerve root, said the surgeon nearest her head, in the clipped Concord trade dialect the station used for anyone without gills. His name badge, translated by the small implant behind Juno's ear, read Vhent Alkadire, Senior Reconstructive. His eyes, 3 of them, the third set high and pale on his forehead, all Ondine, were fixed not on her face, but on a readout she couldn't see. If we extract along the standard vector, we sever the root. She will not walk again. If we leave it, the necrosis reaches her spine in under a day. Then graft around it, said the second voice, older, impatient, standing somewhere near her feet. Use the fragment as a bridging conduit. Root her nerve signal through it until we can grow a proper interface. Through 11,000-year-old alloy of unknown composition, Vhent said. Through 11,000-year-old alloy that is already sitting in a living nerve bed and hasn't killed her yet, the older surgeon snapped. I don't have a better option in the next 4 minutes, Alkadire. Do you? Juno tried to speak and produced only a long, cracked breath. Neither surgeon looked down. She understood, distantly, that whatever anesthetic they'd used had left her conscious enough to hear her own spine being discussed like a plumbing fault, and not conscious enough to do a single thing about it. The hum in her hip climbed half a tone. Do it, Vhent said, bridging graft. Now. What happened next, Juno would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to people who had not been there, and never once succeeding, because there were no words in any language she spoke, human or borrowed, for the sensation of a stranger's careful hands threading a live wire through the exact center of who you were. It did not hurt, not in the way the word usually meant. It arrived instead like memory. Like something that had been waiting in the dark so long it had forgotten the shape of waiting, finding all at once a door. The overhead lights flickered. Every monitor in the room screamed at once, and then, worse, went perfectly silent. Report, Vhent said, sharp now, all impatience burned away into something closer to fear. Talk to me. What did we just do? The senior surgeon didn't answer. He was staring, all three eyes wide at the readout above Juno's hip, where the fragment of black alloy sitting against her spine had begun, very faintly, to glow. 200 kilometers below the station, under 11,000 years of black water and drowned stone, something that had not drawn power in longer than either species present had a word for felt a nervous system connect to it for the first time since the war that built it, and it did the only thing it had ever been built to do. It opened one eye. Juno didn't know any of that yet. What she knew, lying on a table in an operating theater belonging to a species that had not existed when whatever was in her hip went silent, was that the two Ondine surgeons above her had both gone very still, and that the humming in her side had stopped being a sound and started being a voice, low and slow and endless, saying something she could almost understand. Then the anesthetic caught up with her, and the world went out like a snuffed candle. She woke to gray light and the smell of recycled air and antiseptic gel, in a room too clean and too quiet to be anything but a recovery ward. Her side ached in a long, deep line from hip to ribs, the particular ache of tissue that had been opened and closed by hands, not by violence. Her mouth was dry. Somewhere to her left, a monitor kept up a soft, patient rhythm that was, she realized after a moment of listening, not quite matching her own heartbeat. It was a fraction ahead of it, like something walking half a step in front of her, showing the way. "You're awake," said a voice, and Juno turned her head to find Daishi Akoro folded into the chair beside her bed, still in his dive coveralls, salt-crusted and unslept, looking at her like she'd come back from somewhere he hadn't been sure led anywhere at all. "You've been out 11 hours. They wouldn't tell me anything except that you were stable and that I wasn't allowed near the surgical wing." He tried for a grin and didn't quite make it. Which, frankly, tracks. You've never once been allowed near anything you wanted. 11 hours, Juno repeated. Her voice came out as gravel. "Feels like I blinked." "You want water?" She nodded, and he poured it with hands that weren't quite steady. And she noticed, because she noticed everything now with a strange new sharpness, that the water in the cup trembled in tiny concentric rings before he ever touched it, the deck under them thrumming, faint and low, with a vibration that had no obvious source. "Daishi," she pushed herself half upright, ignoring the pull of stitches, "is the station shaking?" He went still in the particular way people go still, when they've been told not to say something, and are deciding whether to say it anyway. "There's been some kind of seismic event," he said carefully. "Down on Karst Vanter. Started about 10 hours ago. The Concord's calling it a subsidence, the flood fortress settling, nothing structural up here. They've grounded all salvage traffic until it clears." 10 hours ago. Juno did the math without wanting to and arrived, cold all the way through, at the same number twice. "Daishi," she said again, "what did they take out of me?" He didn't get the chance to answer, because that was the moment the door opened and Administrator Farah Solt walked in with 2 aides, and the particular unhurried urgency of someone who has spent a career learning to look calm while the walls come down around her, and said, in a voice pitched for a much larger room, "Ms. Vashti, I need you to tell me everything you remember about touching that wall." Farah Solt did not look like a woman who ran an orbital trauma station, and by extension, the fragile truce between the custodian Concord and every scrap consortium licensed to work the Vanter ruins. She looked, if anything, like someone's tired aunt, soft-featured, gray-skinned in the particular pale blue-gray of her kind, dressed in an administrator's plain gray wrap rather than any ceremonial color. But her third eye, the pale one set above the other two, did not blink when the other two did, and it was fixed on Juno now with an attention that made the hair on her arms rise. "I touched a seam in the wall," Juno said. "It looked like a maintenance panel." "It wasn't." "What did it feel like?" "Warm." Juno thought about lying, about softening it, and then thought about the fragment sitting in her own spine, and decided lying to the woman who ran the hospital keeping her alive was not a strategy with a long shelf life. It felt like touching a hand that was about to close around mine. I got my glove back about half a second before the wall did whatever it did. Farah exchanged a look with one of her aides, a younger Ondine with a data slate already glowing, that Juno had seen 100 times on 100 worse days. The look of two professionals confirming, without speaking, that things had just gotten significantly worse. "Show her," Farah said. The aide turned the slate. On it, a false-color seismic map of Karstvanter's drowned surface, familiar to Juno from 4 years of pre-dive briefings, except that it was wrong in a way that made her stomach fold. The fortress's old defensive perimeter, a ring of buried pylons her survey charts had always marked as inert dead weight, scrap value only, was lit end to end in soft, pulsing cyan, like a string of lights someone had just found the switch for after a very long search in the dark. 10 hours ago, Farah said, at the exact moment my surgical team completed an emergency nerve graft using a fragment recovered from your wound site. Every one of those 41 structures began drawing power from a source we cannot locate, cannot measure, and until 10 hours ago, did not believe still existed. We have 3 ships and a research annex on the surface who are reporting fluctuations in their own systems consistent with induced resonance. We have a warden marshal in my anteroom right now demanding I hand you over for what he is calling, and I am quoting directly, containment assessment. She let that sit. So before I decide whether that happens, Ms. Vashti, I am going to ask you again, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. Has anything like this ever happened to you before? Any dreams? Any objects that seem to respond to you? Any family history you've been told and dismissed as superstition? Juno opened her mouth to say no, and then stopped, because the honest answer sitting behind her teeth surprised her as much as it was clearly about to surprise everyone else in the room. Her grandmother's pendant. It had come down through 3 generations of Vashti women, a small disc of the same silver-black alloy currently glowing under her ribs, worn smooth by 140 years of thumbs. Her grandmother Odalys had called it a wedding token from a world nobody in the family had lived on in 5 generations, had worn it every day of her life, and been buried with a copy, because the real one had gone, by her own instruction, to Juno on her 18th birthday, tucked into a box with a note that said, "Only keep this closer than you think you need to." Juno had worn it exactly twice, found it too heavy for diving work, and left it in a drawer in her cabin for 4 years, mildly embarrassed by sentiment she didn't understand and had never asked her grandmother to explain, because by the time she was old enough to want to ask, Odalys was gone. "There's a pendant," Juno heard herself say, "family heirloom. Old alloy, I always figured it was just decorative, something a great-grandparent picked up on a conquered world before the family came back this way. I haven't worn it in years. It's in my cabin." Farah's third eye did not blink. "Bring it," she said to her aide, who was already moving. Then, to Juno, in a voice that had gone very quiet, "Ms. Vashti, what do you know about the war that built Karstvanter's fortress ring?" "Nothing," Juno said honestly. "Nobody does. It's from before the conquered, before your written history, near as anyone's ever dated the strata. Everyone always figured it was some kind of coastal defense grid. Dead tech. That's the whole reason Halyard got a scrap license for it. Nothing down there's supposed to still be live." "It isn't dead tech," Farah said. "It's a weapon." The word sat in the recovery ward like something with weight of its own. 41 pylons, Farah went on, networked into a single system. Your survey charts label a defensive perimeter because that is the only word your consortium's translation algorithms had a category for. What it actually is, what our own oldest records call it, in a tongue 3 languages removed from anything I speak fluently, is a choir. A weapon built to end a war so old that even the people who fought it are footnotes in strata 12 meters down. It was silenced by its own makers, deliberately, because it did what it was built to do too well, and because they could not live with what came after. It has not drawn power in 11,000 years. And 10 hours ago, in my operating theater, a piece of it woke up inside a human diving contractor's spine and started calling out to something across a planet's worth of drowned stone. Juno's mouth had gone dry again, and this time the water cup was still empty. Calling out to what? She made herself ask. To you, Farah said. As far as we can currently determine, it is calling out to you. The aide came back faster than Juno expected, breathless, carrying a small gray case that she set on the foot of the bed with the particular reverence of someone who has just been told to treat a piece of costume jewelry like an unexploded device. Farah opened it herself. Inside, on a bed of gray foam, the pendant lay exactly as Juno had left it 4 years ago, except that now, in the recovery ward's flat white light, she could see clearly for the first time what she had never let herself really look at before. A design worked into the disc's surface too fine and too regular to be decoration. A spiral of interlocking marks that matched, line for line, the pulsing cyan pattern still glowing on the aide's data slate. Farah looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Juno, and something in her face, some careful administrator's composure, cracked just slightly, into an expression that was harder to name. Ms. Vashti, she said, I don't believe your family came back this way at all. I believe your family never left. Down the corridor, loud enough to carry through 2 sets of doors, a new voice was arguing with station security in the clipped, furious cadence of a man who had spent his career being obeyed and did not intend to stop today. Juno didn't need Farah's flinch to know who it was. She'd catch his name soon enough, Warden Marshal Corvi Thesson, Concord Defense Compact, and he would spend the next several hours making it very clear that as far as he was concerned, the correct containment protocol for a live weapon system speaking through a human nervous system was to remove the human nervous system. For now, all Juno knew was that the pendant her grandmother had told her to keep closer than she thought she needed was glowing faintly in its case, in perfect, patient rhythm with the wound in her side, and that somewhere under 200 kilometers of black water, something that had been asleep since before this station's builders learned to walk upright had just learned her name. Corvi Thesson was shorter than Juno expected, built like something meant to be dropped from orbit and survive the landing, with skin a deeper slate gray than Farah's, and a defense compact uniform that had clearly been designed by someone who understood that fear needed a silhouette. He came into the recovery ward without waiting to be invited, 2 armed escorts a pace behind him, and looked at Juno the way she imagined he looked at unexploded ordnance, with professional interest and zero warmth. Ms. Vashti, he didn't offer a hand, human or otherwise. I'm told you're carrying an active fragment of the Vanter Choir's control lattice fused to your spinal column, and that removing it by any method currently available to this station's surgical staff will kill you. Is that your understanding as well? That's what I've been told, yeah. Then you understand my problem. He said it flatly, without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. I have 41 weapon platforms coming back online under a flooded fortress that once, according to what little our own Strata record preserved, ended a war by ending everyone on both sides of it. I have a research annex and 3 dredging vessels currently sitting inside its engagement envelope. And I have exactly 1 living interface to that system, and she is a licensed scrap contractor from a species that has held Concord Treaty status for less than 60 years. I am not going to pretend that doesn't concern me. It concerns me too, Juno said and meant it. I didn't ask for this. I believe you. Thesson's third eye, pale like Farah's, like every Ondine's, she was starting to notice. The mark of whatever sense let them read a room a human couldn't, tracked something on her face she wasn't aware of showing. Which is precisely why I intend to have you moved to a secure containment ring on the compact's own station, under full sedation, until my engineers determine whether the choir can be forced back into dormancy without your cooperation. You can't sedate a nerve graft into silence, Vehent Alkadire said from the doorway, arms folded, looking like a man who had been having this argument in the corridor for the last 10 minutes and had lost none of the fight in it. The fragment isn't reading her consciousness, Marshal. It's reading her nervous system. Sedated, awake, asleep. It doesn't care. All sedation buys you is a patient who can't tell you what she's feeling while the thing in her spine does whatever it's going to do anyway. Then perhaps, Thesson said, your team should not have fused an active weapon component into a civilian's central nervous system in the first place. Your objection is noted, Marshal, and it is 11 hours too late. And if you'd like to propose a surgical alternative that doesn't leave her paralyzed from the hip down, I am extremely eager to hear it. Vehent's voice had an edge Juno hadn't heard from him yet. In the meantime, she is my patient. This is my ward, and you will not be moving her anywhere until Administrator Solt and I agree it won't kill her. Thesson looked at Feyre. Feyre looked back at him with the specific patience of someone who had outranked men like him for longer than he'd been in uniform. He stays out of my medical decisions, Marshal, Feyre said, and you get real-time seismic and resonance data instead of a corpse and a mystery. That's the offer. I'd take it before the Compact Council asks why you turned a stabilized incident into a dead civilian. The room held its breath, or the Ondine version of it, 3 sets of nostrils flaring in near unison, and then Thesson inclined his head a precise 2 degrees, the smallest possible surrender, and turned for the door. I'll have a security detail posted, he said, not quite a question, and I want hourly resonance telemetry. You'll get both, Feyre said. Now get out of my ward. He went. Juno let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since he walked in, and found her hands were shaking, not from fear exactly. She'd been more afraid 300 meters under black water with a gantry coming down on her, but from the particular exhaustion of having just watched 3 people argue about whether she got to keep her own spine. Sorry about him, Vehent said, coming to check the readout above her bed with hands that had gone gentle again. All the edge dropped out of his voice now that the room had emptied. He's not wrong to be frightened. He's just bad at being frightened in a way that doesn't scare other people worse. Is he right, though? Juno asked. About the fragment reading my nervous system, about it not caring whether I'm asleep. Vehent was quiet a moment, checking something on the slate, and when he answered, he didn't look up. I don't know what it's reading, Ms. Vashti. I've spent 11 years doing neural interface work, and I have never in my career seen a graft substrate behave like this one. It isn't rejecting your tissue. It isn't inert, either. He searched for the word, found it with visible reluctance. It's listening. And I don't think it likes what it's hearing from outside this room, nearly as much as it likes what it's hearing from you. That night, if night meant anything on a station in permanent orbital dusk, all its light manufactured, all its dark manufactured too, Juno didn't sleep so much as fall through a series of rooms that weren't rooms. She stood, or something like standing, in a vast drowned hall lit by a cyan glow that came from everywhere and nowhere, water moving slow overhead in a ceiling that had once, she somehow knew without being told, been open sky. Pillars rose around her in ranks, each one carved with the same spiral pattern worked into her grandmother's pendant, and at the center of the hall a shape sat that was not a throne and not a machine, but something that had elements of both, dark and vast and utterly, patiently still. It did not speak, not yet, but she felt it turn toward her the way you feel someone's gaze land on the back of your neck in a crowded room, and she felt, underneath the fear that should have swallowed her whole, something else, something that felt uncomfortably, undeniably like recognition. Like coming home to a house she'd never lived in and finding her own boot prints already worn into the floor. She woke gasping, hand pressed to the line of stitches along her ribs. The pendant, someone had put it back in its case at her bedside, at her own quiet insistence, glowing faintly enough in the dark that she could see her own fingers by it. Daishi was asleep in the chair, chin on his chest, and it was the sound of her breathing that woke him, his head snapping up, immediately alert in the particular way of someone who'd spent the last 2 days waiting for exactly this. "You okay?" "I saw it," Juno said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "The choir, I saw where it lives." He didn't ask her to explain, not yet. He just reached over and took her free hand, the one not resting against her stitches, and held on, and outside the recovery ward's narrow window, 200 kilometers below, one more of the 41 drowned pylons finished its long climb back to wakefulness and turned its silent, patient attention toward the surface of the water. The station's archive annex was smaller than Juno expected, a single long room walled in data cores instead of books, tended by an Andine archivist named Reverent, who was older than anyone else Juno had met on the station, skin gone the pale, mottled gray-blue of great age, third eye clouded but no less sharp for it. Farah brought Juno down herself the next morning, over Thesson's objection, on the grounds that if the choir was going to keep talking to her through her dreams, someone had better find out what it was likely to say. "Vanter Warden," Sale said, before Farah had finished the introduction, studying Juno with an intensity that made her want to check her own reflection for something out of place. "We have a designation for you already, child, and we have had it for longer than your people have had ships that cross open dark. Sit. I have spent 40 years reading records everyone told me were myth, and I am finally going to enjoy being right about them." What Sale told her over the next 2 hours, in a voice that kept catching on details like a man rereading a favorite book, was this: that 11,000 years ago, before the custodian conquered, before any written history the Andine possessed, the builders of Karsvanter's fortress had fought a war so total that it had ended not in victory, but in silence, both sides annihilated so completely that only the weapon remained, and the weapon's own makers, in whatever last hour they had left, had chosen to bind it rather than destroy it, because binding could be undone by the right hand and destruction could not. They had built into the choir a single condition for waking, a bloodline key, carried forward not by law or writ but by blood itself, so that only a true descendant of the original Warden line could ever call it back to service. And they had scattered that bloodline deliberately, across every ship and colony they could reach, so that no single power could ever again hold the whole weapon in one closed fist. Most of that bloodline, Sale said, we assumed extinct. The Conquered's own oldest colonies lost track of their Warden lines within a few thousand years, diluted, forgotten. The old markers bred out or simply unremembered. We had theories. We never had proof. He looked at Juno with something that wasn't quite hunger and wasn't quite awe, but sat close to both. Your species arrived in conquered space 58 years ago, out of a dark stretch of the map nobody had reason to survey. Where do you imagine your family came from before that, Ms. Vashti? Truly. I don't know, Juno admitted. Nobody in my family's history goes back more than about 6 generations. There's a gap. My grandmother used to say we came from the old road, whatever that means. I always figured she was being poetic. Or precise, Sale said, in a language that hadn't survived to translate the term correctly. Farah, standing by the door with her arms folded, cleared her throat. This is fascinating, archivist, and I mean that, but I brought her down here for something more immediately useful. Can we test it? Is she actually the only living key, or is she simply the one who happened to be standing in the wrong room? Sale's mouth did something that might, on a human face, have been a smile. We can test it, he said. Though I suspect, Administrator, you already know what the test will show. The test took most of the following day to arrange, and it was, Juno thought afterward, one of the stranger afternoons of her life. Thesson wanted proof before he'd stand down the containment order, and Farah wanted proof before she'd let him escalate it. So between them they assembled 7 volunteers, 3 Andine researchers with documented ancestry tracing to the oldest known colony lines, 2 compact officers, Daishi, who insisted on being included on the grounds that if this was going to be a circus, he wasn't missing it, and a station engineer of a third species Juno hadn't encountered before, pale and long-limbed, called a threll, and had each of them in turn hold a small secondary fragment of choir alloy that Vihent's team had recovered along with the piece now fused to Juno's spine. Nothing happened. Not for the researchers, not for the officers, not for Daishi, who held the fragment for a long moment with an expression of genuine hope Juno found more moving than she expected, before setting it down with a small, rueful shrug. And not for the threll engineer, who dropped it almost immediately, muttering something about static. Then it was Juno's turn, and the moment her palm closed around the fragment, the pendant at her throat, she'd started wearing it again, unable to explain to herself exactly why, except that leaving it in a drawer now felt like leaving a phone unanswered lit from within, and every readout in the room spiked in perfect unison. And somewhere far below them, a fortress that had been silent for 11,000 years hummed a half-tone higher, glad, if a machine could be glad to be heard. "Well," Sale said quietly into the stunned silence that followed, "there's your proof, Marshal." Thesson didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally spoke, some of the flat certainty had gone out of his voice, replaced by something more careful, more human, if Juno was honest about it. The sound of a man recalculating a threat he'd assumed he understood. "Then she's not a liability," he said slowly. "She's the only lock this thing has ever had, which means whoever controls her controls it." "Nobody controls me, Marshal," Juno said, before Farah could answer for her, surprising herself with how steady it came out. "I'm not a lock. I didn't sign up to be a lock. I got hurt doing a job I've done 4 years running, and your surgeons put a piece of somebody else's war into my spine to save my life, and now apparently I'm supposed to just be whatever this is. Nobody's asked me yet what I want." The room went quiet in a different way. "What do you want, Ms. Vashti?" Farah asked, and it didn't sound rhetorical. Juno thought about the drowned hall in her dream, the vast dark shape at its center turning toward her with a patience that had waited 11,000 years, and clearly intended to wait as long again if it had to. She thought about 41 pylons climbing back to readiness under black water, about a dredging fleet, and a research annex sitting inside what Thesson kept calling an engagement envelope like it was a weather pattern instead of a kill radius. She thought about her grandmother's note, "Keep this closer than you think you need to," written by a woman who must have known, on some level, some fraction of what Juno was only now beginning to understand. "I want to go down there," Juno said. "Not sedated, not contained. I want to go to the source and find out what it actually wants before it decides on its own, and I want somebody in this room to help me instead of just arguing about who gets to decide for me." Nobody answered right away. But Vihent, standing near the back with his arms folded, was nodding slowly, and Daishi's hand had found hers again without either of them quite deciding to let it, and somewhere below the floor of the archive annex, so faint she might have imagined it, Juno felt the hum in her hips settle, for the first time since the operating table, into something that felt almost like relief. It didn't last. 2 hours later, while Farah's staff were still drafting the transport authorization Thesson would spend half the night trying to block, the first of the 41 pylons broke the surface of Karsvanter's black water for the first time in 11,000 years, and the automated defense grid it belonged to, reading 3 unfamiliar vessels sitting inside its ancient engagement envelope, began, very calmly and very methodically, to arm. The alarm that went through either each station wasn't the seismic chime Juno had gotten used to over the last 2 days. It was a deeper klaxon, the kind built to cut through sleep and denial both, and Farah was already running when she reached the recovery ward, gray robes forgotten somewhere behind her, third eye blown wide with an urgency that needed no translation. "Targeting lock," she said, before Juno could ask. The grids acquired the dredging fleet, all 3 vessels. Thesson's ordering an emergency evacuation, but he's got maybe 11 minutes before the pylons finish their firing cycle, and 11 minutes isn't enough to clear 3 ships from a kill radius that size. "Then get me down there," Juno said, already swinging her legs off the bed, ignoring the pull of stitches that hadn't finished healing, ignoring Vihent's immediate sharp objection from the doorway. "You are not cleared for transport," he said. "Your graft site is going to matter a lot less than 3 ships full of people if that thing fires," Juno said. "Vihent, I felt it settle yesterday when I said I wanted to go down. It's listening to me. I don't know how much, I don't know how far that goes, but it's the only lever anyone in this station has right now, and I am done being talked about instead of talked to." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face gave way, not agreement exactly, but the particular surrender of a man who has run out of medically sound objections to something he knows is going to happen with or without his blessing. "Fine," he said, "fine. But I'm coming with you, and the second your vitals redline, we abort, no argument." They didn't get the chance to argue about it further, because that was when Thesson's voice cut through the ward's calm, clipped and furious, and underneath it, for the first time since Juno had met him, genuinely afraid. "Solt, I need the fragment out of her. Now. Full removal, whatever the cost to the patient. If we can sever the neural bridge before the firing cycle completes, the grid may lose its authorization signal and stand down." "That will kill her," Vihent snapped back over the comm, already moving, pulling Juno up by the arm with more urgency than gentleness now. "Marshal, that is not a solution. That is a murder with extra steps. I have 3 ships and 40 people in a kill radius, Alcadire. Weigh that against 1. "I can hear you," Juno said, loud enough to cut through both of them, and the comm went for a second entirely silent. "I'm right here, and I'm telling you don't. Give me the transport. Give me 10 minutes. If it doesn't work, you can do whatever you were going to do anyway, but you do it after I've tried, not instead of." There was a pause long enough that Juno thought he might simply override her, might send whatever security detail he had standing outside the ward to hold her down, while somebody else's hands did to her spine what Vihent's team had so carefully avoided 2 days ago. Then Thesson's voice came back, rougher than she'd heard it. 10 minutes, he said. "Transport's already inbound to your position. Don't waste them." The drop shuttle ride down through Karstvanter's cloud layer was the fastest and roughest of Juno's life, and she spent most of it with her eyes closed, one hand on the pendant at her throat, trying to do the only thing she could think to do, which was simply to be as loud, in whatever way the fragment could hear her, as she knew how. "I'm coming," she thought, over and over, not sure if it was a message or a prayer, or just the only sentence her fear had left room for. "I'm coming, don't fire, I'm coming, wait for me." Whether it hurt her, she couldn't say. But somewhere in the last 90 seconds of descent, with the black water of the drowned fortress rising to meet the shuttle's floodlights, and the dredging fleet's frantic evacuation traffic crackling across every channel at once, the deep ache in her hip that had sat there constant since the operating table sharpened, suddenly, into something almost like a held breath, as if 11,000 years into its patience. The choir had just noticed the thing it had been listening for was finally close enough to answer. The pylons did not fire. Nobody in the shuttle celebrated. There wasn't time, and besides, none of them yet understood why, only that the targeting locks Thesson's people were tracking from orbit had gone, in the space of a single readout cycle, from active engagement to something closer to watchful, waiting, as if the whole grid had paused mid-breath to see what happened next. "It's not disengaging," came Thesson's voice over the comm, tight with a caution that hadn't been there a minute ago. "It's holding. Whatever you're doing down there, Vashti, keep doing it." Juno didn't answer, because she didn't know what she was doing, only that the drowned fortress rising through the shuttle's floodlights, vast broken towers furred in 11,000 years of coral growth, black water sheeting off shapes too regular to be anything but built, was the same architecture from her dream, down to the angle of the light, and that somewhere beneath all of it, patient and enormous and finally awake, something was waiting for her to come the rest of the way down. They found a berth for the shuttle on a drowned platform that had once, Sale's voice explained over the comm from the archive annex, where he was tracking their descent alongside Feyre, been a landing terrace for the fortress's original garrison, wide enough that the shuttle's floodlights barely reached its far edge, its surface a mosaic of the same spiral pattern worked into Juno's pendant, worn by tides but not, she thought, by time in any way that mattered. "There's a shaft," Sale said, 40 meters north of your position, sealed but not powered. If the readings are accurate, it leads directly down to what our oldest records call the choir seat. I want to be extremely clear, Ms. Vashti, that no living being from any species has stood in that chamber in 11,000 years, and I have no way of telling you what you will find. Understood, Juno said, and did not feel understanding so much as a kind of falling calm, the specific quiet that came. She'd noticed over 4 years of diving, right before the moment you either committed to a dive or turned back, and never in between. Hent went with her as far as the shaft's mouth, and then further, ignoring 2 separate attempts by Thesson's relayed voice to order him back to the shuttle, muttering something in Ondine that Juno's implant translated, loosely, as I did not spend 11 years learning to keep people alive, so I could abandon one halfway down a hole. Daisy had wanted to come too and had been overruled by everyone including Juno, who told him, with more honesty than she'd planned, that she needed to know at least one person up top who'd tell the story straight if this went wrong. He hadn't liked it. He'd let her go anyway, which she understood by now was its own kind of answer. The shaft opened, without any door Juno could see give way, the moment her hand came within a meter of it, not mechanically, not with the grind of ancient gears, but the way a held breath releases, silent and total. Cyan light bloomed along channels cut into the shaft walls, climbing ahead of her like something lighting her way home. "It's opening the path itself," Hent said, quiet with something that wasn't quite fear. "Juno. It knows you're here." They descended for what felt like a long time and was, according to the shuttle's chrono when she checked it after, closer to 12 minutes, down through strata of drowned architecture that shifted. The deeper they went, from ruin to something closer to intact, walls unbroken, floors clear of the coral growth that choked every upper level, as if the fortress had spent 11,000 years slowly forgetting itself from the top down while keeping, at its very center, one room in perfect readiness. The chamber, when they reached it, was exactly and not at all like her dream. It was the same vast drowned hall, pillars in ranks, the same impossible ceiling of black water held back by something Juno's mind refused to try to explain. But the shape at the center, the thing that was not a throne and not a machine, was larger than her dream had allowed her to understand, easily the size of the shuttle they'd left topside, dark alloy shot through with veins of cyan light that pulsed, slow and even, like something breathing for the first time in longer than either species present had existed. And around its base, worked into the floor in a ring, were names. Not words Juno's implant could translate. The script was older than anything Sale's archive held a key for, but shapes, hundreds of them, spiraling outward from the machine's base in a pattern that made her chest go tight before she understood why. Because near the innermost ring, worn shallow by something that might have been 11,000 years of nothing touching it at all, was a mark she recognized. The same spiral, the same disc, her grandmother's pendant, carved into stone before the first human ancestor she could name had been born. "Juno." Hent's voice had gone very quiet, very careful, the tone of a man standing somewhere he understood, suddenly and completely, that he did not belong. I think you need to go the rest of the way alone." She didn't argue. She walked forward across a floor 11,000 years old. Past names she couldn't read that had. She was beginning to understand with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the steady patient hum now filling her chest like a second heartbeat. Once belonged to people who shared her blood. The Warden line, scattered on purpose across every ship and colony the old builders could reach, so that no closed fist could ever hold the whole weapon again. Her grandmother's the old road, not poetry, a route, a convoy of ships that had carried among cargo nobody living remembered, a bloodline meant to never fully forget what it was for. She stopped at the base of the machine, close enough now to feel warmth radiating off alloy that had no visible power source, close enough to see her own reflection, small and human and afraid and steady all at once, in a surface polished by nothing but time. "I don't know the right words," she said out loud, into a chamber that had no reason to care whether she spoke at all. "I don't know your language. I don't know what you want or what you think I am. I know you almost killed 40 people 2 hours ago because you thought they were a threat, and I know somewhere back home there's a grandmother who wore a piece of you around her neck for 60 years and never told me why, because maybe she didn't fully know either. So I'm just going to ask you straight, because that's the only way I know how to do anything. What do you need from me?" For a long moment nothing happened. The cyan light kept its slow, even pulse. The water overhead kept its impossible stillness. Vehent, somewhere behind her at the edge of the ring, didn't breathe. Then the pendant at Juno's throat flared, bright enough to throw her shadow long and sharp across the floor of names, and the hum that had lived in her hip since the operating table rose, all at once, into something with shape, not sound exactly, not language exactly, but a pressure behind her ribs that resolved, syllable by syllable, into words she felt more than heard, old and slow and unbearably patient, spoken in a register that made the stone under her boots tremble. "Blood of the binding hand, word of the last house, you have come the long road home." The words didn't fade so much as settle, sinking into the stone and the water and the marrow of Juno's own bones, until she couldn't have said afterward, whether she'd heard them or simply always known them, the way you know your own name. Behind her, Vehent made a sound that wasn't quite a word, 3 eyes wide, one hand braced against a pillar that hadn't been carved by anything his species had ever built. "Juno." The whole grid just changed state. All 41 platforms. Sails reading it from orbit right now. It's not arming, it's not disengaging. He searched the readout on his wrist unit, and his voice, when he found the word, had gone unsteady in a way Juno hadn't heard from him yet. "It's recalibrating, like it's waking up all the way for the first time since it went dark. Juno, I don't think this was the last step. I think this was the first one." She should have felt fear at that. Some part of her did, distant and small, the animal part of her brain that had spent 4 years learning to respect deep water and old machinery in equal measure. But mostly what she felt, standing at the base of a weapon that had just called her blood of the binding hand in a voice like tectonic plates settling, was a kind of vertigo she recognized from the exact moment she'd first understood, at 19, just how much pressure 300 meters of ocean actually put on a human body. The sense of having stepped, without quite meaning to, past every safe depth she'd ever charted. "Define waking up all the way," she said. She got her answer before Vehent could give it. The cyan light threading the machine's alloy surface brightened all at once, climbing not just through the chamber's ceiling of held-back water but outward, she understood with a lurch, through the fortress itself, up through 11,000 years of drowned stone toward the surface, and somewhere above them, muffled by 200 meters of water and rock, a sound began that she felt in her teeth before she consciously registered it as sound at all. 41 pylons in perfect unison, beginning to sing. "Orbital comms lighting up," Vehent said, reading something off his wrist unit with the particular flatness of a man trying very hard not to panic out loud. "Thesson's fleet," he called in reinforcements the second the targeting lock went active. 3 compact cruisers, They're inbound now, ETA under 6 minutes, and the grid's reading them as unidentified mass entering the engagement envelope. Tell him to turn them around. I'm telling him. He says he can't recall authorization, has to route through compact command. That's a chain of custody thing. It's not instant. Then I don't have 6 minutes, Juno said, and turned back to the machine, to the slow, patient pulse of light still climbing through its veins, and found that the vertigo had steadied, somewhere in the last 10 seconds, into something closer to clarity. It had called her blood of the binding hand. It had called her the last house, come home. If any of that meant what she thought it meant, then whatever this thing was about to do next, it was going to do because it believed, in whatever way a machine 11,000 years old was capable of belief, that it was protecting her. Which meant the only voice in this chamber, with any hope of stopping it, was hers. I need you to listen to me, she said, out loud, to the machine, to the water, to the names carved into the floor by people who had shared her blood and were long past caring whether anyone remembered them. Those ships aren't a threat. They're mine, they're my people. They came because I'm down here, not because they mean you harm. If you fire on them because of me, that's not protection. That's exactly what got you sealed the first time. I need you to hold. Please. Hold. The pulse in the alloy stuttered. The first hesitation Juno had felt from it since the operating table. And for one long, terrible second she thought she'd misjudged everything. Thought the plea had landed as weakness instead of command. Thought 11,000 years of patient waiting was about to end in the worst possible way. Then the singing in the stone changed pitch, dropped half a tone, and held. Grid's stable, Vehent said, disbelief thick in his voice. Targetings, it's still tracking the cruisers, Juno, but it's not moving to engage. It's just watching them. Watching, waiting. The exact posture, she understood with a chill that had nothing to do with the water overhead, that it had held for 11,000 years before her hand found a seam in a wall it wasn't supposed to have found at all. That's not the end of it, is it? She said, mostly to herself, mostly because saying it out loud made it easier to accept. It's not going back to sleep. Not really. Not unless I tell it something more than hold. No, said a new voice, quiet and old, and Juno turned to find Sale Varen's projected image flickering into being at the edge of the ring of names, patched through from the archive annex 200 kilometers up, his clouded third eye somehow, even as a projection, fixed directly on her. It will not, child, and I owe you an apology, because I let you walk down here believing the hardest part of this was reaching it. It was not. I have spent the last hour reading records I did not have full context for until I watched what just happened to that grid, and I need you to understand something before you say anything else to that machine. Say it fast, Archivist. I don't know how long hold buys us. The choir was not sealed because its makers feared their enemies, Sale said. Their enemies were long since ash by the time the binding was written. It was sealed because the last generation of wardens, your ancestors, child, in blood if not in name, found that commanding it did something to the one who held the key. It does not merely obey. It amplifies. Whatever the warden wants most, in the moment of true command, the choir will move heaven and drown earth to give them. The last house did not go into exile because they were afraid of losing control of the weapon. His voice, even flattened by transmission distance, carried a weight that settled over the chamber like the water overhead. They went into exile because they were afraid of what they wanted, once they realized the weapon would actually give it to them. Juno stood very still, one hand still resting against alloy that pulsed warm under her palm like something with a heartbeat of its own, and thought about every version of herself that might stand in this chamber and ask for something. The version that had spent 4 years diving wrecks for a scrap contractor because it paid better than anything else she was qualified for. The version that had watched a gantry come down and known, with total certainty, that nobody was coming fast enough. The version, deeper down, that had grown up in a family with a gap in its history and a grandmother's careful warning, and had spent her whole life feeling like she was one door short of understanding who she actually was. What would that version ask for, if a weapon that could apparently give her anything asked what she wanted most? The thought frightened her more than the cruisers had. "Then I'm not going to ask it for anything," she said, out loud, steady, more to herself and to Sale and to V-Hint than to the machine, though she suspected, by now, it was listening to all of it regardless. "Not yet. Not until I understand exactly what I'm holding before I decide what to do with it." Somewhere above the ceiling of held-back water, the singing of 41 pylons dropped another half-tone, patient, waiting, and Juno could have sworn, though she'd have struggled to explain how she knew it, approving. Thesson met them at the landing terrace when the shuttle finally surfaced, and for the first time since Juno had met him, he didn't come flanked by armed escorts. He came alone, in a suit still damp from the transit tube, and stood at the edge of the platform with his arms folded, and an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the flat professional wariness of their first meeting, but something closer to a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. "Grid's holding," he said, before she'd fully climbed down from the shuttle. "Watching, not engaging. My cruisers are keeping their distance per your request, which I want on record I did not authorize and am allowing anyway because apparently a scrap diver has better instincts about an 11,000-year-old superweapon than my entire tactical staff." He looked at her for a long moment. "I owe you an apology, Ms. Vashti. I spent 2 days treating you like a containment risk. You may actually be the only reason 40 people are still breathing tonight." "I noticed," Juno said, not unkindly, because she was too tired to manage much more than honesty. "Doesn't mean I trust you not to try the sedation thing again the second you're scared enough." "No," Thesson agreed. "It doesn't. I won't pretend that fear's gone, Vashti. I've got a weapon system online that could erase this entire orbital theater in an afternoon, and its only off switch is a civilian I have no legal authority over and no way to protect if the wrong people in the compact decide you're more useful dead and unbondable than alive and unpredictable." He said it flatly, without drama, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted it. "There are factions on the Compact Council right now arguing that the correct response to what happened today is to glass the fortress from orbit before the grid finishes recalibrating. I've held them off for the moment by telling them you have it stable. I'd like that to stay true." "It's not stable," Juno said. "It's listening. Those aren't the same thing." "No," Thesson said again. "I don't imagine they are." Farah was waiting for her in the recovery ward this time, along with Daishi, who didn't say anything at all when Juno came through the door, just crossed the room and put his arms around her, careful of the stitches, careful of everything, and held on long enough that she felt some of the last 2 hours' vertigo finally settle into something she could carry. "Sale's got something you need to see," Farah said eventually, gently, once Daishi had let her sit. "It came out of the deep archive while you were down there. I think it's your grandmother, Juno. I think it's the last thing she ever recorded." The file, when Sale brought it up on the ward's main display, was old and badly compressed, clearly transferred from some format Etherreach's systems could barely still read. And for a moment Juno thought there'd been a mistake, that this couldn't possibly be her grandmother, because the woman on the screen was younger than Juno had ever known her, dark-haired, unlined, standing in what looked like the cargo hold of a very old ship, the same pendant hanging at her throat. "If anyone ever finds this," Odalys Vashti said, in a voice Juno hadn't heard in 11 years and would have known anywhere, in any static across any distance, "it means the old road's been found again, and it means somebody in the family finally needed to know the truth I never had the courage to tell them outright." She touched the pendant at her throat, the same unconscious gesture Juno realized, with a jolt that she herself had been making for 2 days without noticing. "We are the last house of a bloodline nobody was ever supposed to remember, carrying the key to something so old and so dangerous that our own ancestors chose to disappear rather than risk one of us ever using it wrong. I wore this because my mother told me to and her mother told her, and none of us knew the whole shape of what we were guarding, only that we were guarding something, and that the day it woke up again would be the most dangerous day of whoever's life it happened to. Her eyes, on the recording, found the camera with an intensity that Juno felt in her chest like a physical weight. If that's you, if you're hearing this because it woke up, I need you to know it isn't a gift. It's a debt 11,000 years old and it comes due whether you want it or not. But I also need you to know this. Whatever it asks of you, whatever it offers you, you get to decide what kind of warden you are. Nobody before you got that right. Every single one of them let the weapon decide for them in the end, and every single one of them regretted it. Don't, whoever you are, don't let it decide for you. The recording ended. The ward was very quiet. She knew, Juno said finally, when she trusted her voice not to break on it. My whole life. She knew this might happen and she stopped, pressed the heel of her hand hard against her eyes and made herself finish the sentence anyway, because her grandmother on that recording had asked her to be honest about hard things, and it seemed like the least Juno could do to start now. She never told me because she was scared it would happen to me the way it happened to whoever came before her. She was trying to protect me by keeping me ignorant, and instead I just walked into it blind, with a torn suit and bad luck and no idea what I was actually touching. She also told you to keep it closer than you think you need to, Farah said quietly, which means some part of her believed you'd need it someday. She didn't just protect you, Juno. She prepared you in the only way she thought she safely could. Juno didn't have an answer for that. She sat with the pendant warm in her palm, 11,000 years of inherited weight settling into a shape that finally, for the first time since the operating table, made some kind of terrible sense. And outside the ward's window, 200 kilometers below, 41 pylons kept their patient, singing watch, waiting for the last house to decide what kind of warden she was going to be. The compact council convened by relay 2 hours later. 7 delegates patched in from 4 different stations, and Farah insisted Juno attend in person rather than simply be discussed in absentia, which was how she found herself standing in a small conference annex off the recovery ward, still in a borrowed medical robe, facing down a wall of projected faces that ranged from cautiously sympathetic to openly hostile. The hostile end of that spectrum had a name, Counselor Yeslin Dreeth, representing the Compact's outer survey holdings, a narrow-faced Ondine with a voice like a closing door, who did not waste time on preamble. I have reviewed the telemetry, Dreeth said. 41 platforms online, full resonance across the grid, a weapon system capable of orbital-scale destruction, now keyed to a single organic interface with no formal compact citizenship and no verifiable loyalty beyond 4 years of contract labor. I do not understand why we are debating containment options. I understand why we are debating whether we have time left to exercise any. The grid held fire on 3 of our own cruisers this afternoon, Farah said, before Juno could respond. Because of her, Counselor, not despite her. Today, Dreeth said. It held fire today because the interface asked it nicely. I would like someone in this meeting to explain to me what happens the day it doesn't feel like asking nicely, or the day someone with less restraint than Ms. Vashti finds a way to make use of her instead. Then station a fleet in orbit and watch, Thesson said, unexpectedly, from where he stood near the back of the annex, the last voice Juno had expected to speak in her defense, and from the way Dreeth's projected face tightened, clearly the last voice he'd expected either. I've spent 2 days building a threat assessment on this exact scenario, Counselor, and my professional recommendation is that a live weapon system with a cooperative, willing interface is a vastly safer proposition than a live weapon system with no interface at all, which is what we'd have the moment somebody's orbital strike kills Ms. Vashti and leaves the choir fully awake, unbound, and answering to nobody. You want to glass the fortress. I want to point out that we do not currently know whether the grid survives that, whether it retaliates, or whether it simply migrates its control signature to the next descendant of that bloodline it can find, somewhere in a species we have not yet met and have even less leverage over. Dreeth was quiet for a moment, visibly recalculating, the way Juno had watched Thesson himself recalculate 2 days earlier. "And your recommendation, Marshal?" "Time," Thesson said. "Give her time to understand what she's holding under close but non-lethal observation before we make any decision that can't be undone. If in a week's time the grid is still escalating, still hostile, still expanding its reach, then we revisit the harder options. But we do not open with the harder options against the one lead we have who's kept it calm so far." It wasn't a full victory. Dreeth's face, even flattened by relay static, made clear that a week was a number he intended to hold everyone to with exact precision, and that his vote for the harder options had only been delayed, not withdrawn. But it was enough for now, and when the relay finally cut and the annex emptied, Juno found herself alone with Farah and a silence that felt, for the first time in 2 days, less like danger and more like simple exhaustion. "A week," Juno said. "A week," Farah agreed. "Use it well." She tried. Over the next 4 days, Juno spent more hours than she could count in the drowned chamber beneath Karstvanter, descending each time with Vhent monitoring her vitals from the shuttle and Sail patched through from the archive with whatever fragment of 11,000-year-old context he'd managed to translate since the last visit, learning, slowly, carefully, the way she'd once learned to read a wreck's structural stress before she trusted her weight to any of it, the actual shape of what she was bonded to. The choir, she came to understand, was not a mind in any sense her species had a word for. It did not think the way she thought. It held instead a kind of vast patient intention, built by makers who had wanted, more than anything else in their last desperate hour, a guardian rather than a weapon, and had run out of time to fully separate the two before they sealed it away. It remembered its makers the way a held breath remembers the lungs that held it, not as individuals, not as names, but as a shape of purpose it had been carrying, unfulfilled, for 11,000 years. And it wanted, more than it wanted anything else Juno could find language for, to finally be done waiting. "That's the danger," she told Vhent on the 4th evening, sitting on the edge of the landing terrace with her boots dangling into black water that hadn't held a living thing above a certain depth in longer than either of their species had existed. "It's not malicious. It's not even really a weapon anymore, not the way Dreeth thinks about it. It's just tired. 11,000 years of holding a breath is a long time to hold anything, and it would give almost anything to whoever finally let it exhale." "That sounds like exactly the kind of thing a weapon would want you to believe," Vhent said, gently, no accusation in it, just the same careful realism he'd brought to every conversation since the operating table. "I know," Juno said. "I think about that every single time I go down there. I think about my grandmother's recording every single time, too. Don't let it decide for you." She looked out at the black water, at the faint cyan glow rising through it from 200 meters down, patient and endless. "I keep asking myself what I actually wanted to exhale into, and I don't have an answer yet that isn't selfish in some direction or another." "What would selfish even look like?" Vhent asked, "for you?" Juno thought about it seriously, because he'd asked seriously, and because some part of her had been circling the question for 4 days without letting herself land on it. "Command it," she said finally quiet. "Really command it. Not ask, not negotiate, command, the way Sail says the old wardens eventually did, right before they realized what they'd become. I could end every argument in that council chamber in about 10 seconds if I did. I could make Dreeth's fear irrelevant. I could make Thesson's cruisers irrelevant. I could probably make myself very hard for anyone ever again to threaten, hurt, or overrule." She turned the pendant over once in her fingers, feeling its warmth, its patience, its enormous waiting weight. "And I think if I ever actually let myself want that, even for a second, with my hand on that alloy, it would give it to me. That's what scares me more than Dreeth's cruisers ever could. Vihent didn't say anything for a while. Then he reached over, careful of the healing line along her ribs, and put his hand briefly over hers, not the pendant, just her hand, warm and solid and entirely, reassuringly ordinary. Then don't put your hand on the alloy until you've made peace with not wanting that, he said. You have time, use it. She didn't get as much of it as either of them hoped. 2 nights later, while she slept in the recovery ward with the pendant warm at her throat and Daisy dozing in the chair he'd more or less claimed permanently, the door alarm that should have required 3 separate authorizations to bypass chimed once softly and went dark, and 4 armored figures who did not belong to Thessen's defense compact detail came through it with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people who had planned this for longer than the weak Dreeth had publicly agreed to. Juno woke to a gloved hand clamped hard over her mouth, and the cold press of a restraint cuff already closing around her wrist before her eyes had finished adjusting to the dark. She didn't scream, couldn't, with the hand sealed over her jaw, but she twisted hard enough to knock the water cup off the bedside table, loud in the quiet ward, and that was enough. Daisy came up out of the chair already swinging, catching the nearest armored figure across the side of the helmet with the flat of his forearm, and for one chaotic second the room was noise and shadow, and the particular sick clarity that came. Juno had learned 300 meters underwater, right before violence resolved itself one way or another. It resolved badly for Daisy. A second figure caught him from behind, twisting his arm up hard enough that Juno heard the gasp he bit down rather than let out, and pinned him face first against the wall with a competence that told her, even through the fear, that these were not station security overreacting to a false alarm. "Quiet," said the one holding her, voice flattened by a helmet filter, no cruelty in it, which somehow frightened her more than cruelty would have. "We're not here to hurt you, Vashti. We're here to finish what your marshal's too cautious to finish himself." "Dreeth," Juno managed, around the hand that had loosened just enough to let her speak. "This is Dreeth's people." "Counselor Dreeth believes in decisive action," the figure said. "Move." They had her out of the ward and into a service corridor before the ward's own alarm finished its first cycle, moving with the rehearsed speed of a team that had mapped either reach's security blind spots in advance, which told Juno, distantly, underneath the adrenaline, that this hadn't been improvised in the last 2 nights. This had been planned since the council meeting, maybe before it, a contingency built the moment Dreeth realized his vote for the harder options might not carry. She didn't fight the corridor. Fighting 4 armed and armored professionals in a hallway was a fast way to end up dead rather than merely captured, and some cold, calculating part of her, the part that had spent 4 years reading structural stress in drowned buildings, and knew exactly when a wall was about to give and when it was merely groaning, understood that her only real leverage wasn't in her fists. It was 200 kilometers straight down. They took her not to an airlock, not to some black site holding cell, but to a small transport bay Juno didn't recognize, where a fast courier shuttle sat with its ramp already down, engines already warm, and she understood, with a lurch of real fear that finally cracked through the calculation, exactly what Dreeth actually intended. "You're taking me to the fortress," she said. Counselor Dreeth's assessment is that the choir's interface represents an unacceptable ongoing risk, the lead figure said, guiding her up the ramp with a grip that allowed no argument, and that the safest permanent solution is to sever that interface at the source, under controlled conditions, before the compact council's caution costs more lives than it saves. You will be taken to the chamber. You will be made to command the grid to a full and permanent shutdown. If you cooperate, this ends without further injury to you or anyone else. And if the grid doesn't take permanent shutdown as an order it's willing to follow." The figure didn't answer that, which was its own answer, and Juno understood, as the ramp sealed behind her and the shuttle's engines climbed toward launch pitch, that Dreeth's real plan, The one his own soldiers might not even have been told in full, very likely didn't survive her giving that order at all. A dead interface and a permanently silenced weapon were, from a certain cold arithmetic, the same acceptable outcome. She thought of her grandmother's recording, "Don't let it decide for you." She thought, with a stab of guilt sharper than the fear, of Daisy pinned against the ward wall, of V Hint asleep somewhere down the corridor with no idea any of this was happening, of Farah waking in a few hours to find her only working lever on an 11,000-year-old superweapon simply gone. And she thought, underneath all of it, steady and strange, of the chamber itself, the ring of names, the slow, patient pulse of alloy that had called her blood of the binding hand and meant it, and found that some small, stubborn part of her was not afraid of going back down there at all. It was afraid of what Dreeth's people were about to ask her to do once she arrived. The descent took less time than her first trip down, the shuttle diving faster than safety protocols allowed, its pilot clearly under orders to move before Theson's own forces could organize a pursuit. Juno spent the drop with her wrists still cuffed, watching black water rise through the viewport, feeling the pendant at her throat grow warmer with every meter of altitude they lost, until by the time the shuttle set down on the same drowned landing terrace she'd stood on 4 days earlier, it was burning bright enough to see through the fabric of her robe. "It knows I'm scared," she said mostly to herself as they marched her toward the shaft. "It's going to know exactly what you're asking me to do the second I get down there." "Then I'd advise you to convince it otherwise," the lead figure said, "for both our sakes." The chamber felt different this time before she'd even crossed the threshold. The cyan light along the shaft walls sharper, faster, less like a path lighting itself for a welcome guest, and more like something bracing. "It knows," Juno thought, and felt the pendant answer with a pulse that ran the length of her arm like current. "It already knows." Dreeth's soldiers marched her across the ring of names at gunpoint, though Juno noted, with the same cold clarity she'd used to survive the transport, that none of the weapons were actually pointed at her. They were pointed outward, toward the machine itself, toward the vast dark shape whose pulse had gone in the last 30 seconds from slow and patient to something faster, harder, closer to a held breath about to break. "Command it," the lead figure said, releasing her wrist cuffs with a click, shoving her the last few steps toward the base of the alloy. "Full shutdown, permanent dormancy. Tell it in whatever language it answers to, and tell it now." Juno stood at the base of the machine, close enough to feel the heat radiating off it, close enough to see her own reflection again in its polished surface. And this time, she understood with a lurch, the reflection wasn't steady. It was shaking, faintly, in time with a vibration that had started somewhere deep in the stone beneath her boots. "It's not going to like that order," she said, without turning around. "You should know that before I give it." "That's not my concern, give the order." "It's about to be everyone's concern," Juno said, "because I don't think it's going to hear shut down permanently as a request from me. I think it's going to hear it as a threat from you. You marched armed soldiers into a sealed chamber and pointed weapons at the one thing on this planet that spent 11,000 years learning to read exactly that kind of gesture. If you wanted this to go quietly, you picked the single worst way to ask for it." She felt it then, the way you feel weather change before the sky itself confirms it. A pressure building in the chamber's air, in the water overhead, in the marrow of her own bones where the fragment had lived for 4 days now like a second, patient pulse. The alloy's light didn't brighten so much as sharpen, every vein of cyan drawing taut, and somewhere in the pattern of shifting light Juno felt, unmistakably, something that had been holding very still for a very long time begin, at last, to consider moving. "It's reading you as a threat," she said, louder now, urgent. "All of you, right now, you need to lower the weapons. Give the order, Vashti." The chamber's floor lit from beneath their feet, every carved name in the ring flaring bright at once, and one of Dreeth's soldiers, the youngest of the 4, Juno would think later, from the pitch of the voice inside the helmet, made the single worst decision available to anyone in that room and fired a warning shot into the base of the machine. It wasn't a warning to the choir. It was, Juno understood in the half-second before everything happened at once, exactly the confirmation 11,000 years of patient waiting had apparently been braced for the entire time. The response wasn't fire, wasn't the orbital-scale devastation Dreeth's council had spent a week fearing. It was simpler than that, and in its way more frightening. 4 narrow bands of cyan light lancing out from the machine's base and closing, gentle as a hand and utterly immovable, around each of the 4 soldiers, lifting them a clean meter off the chamber floor and holding them there, weapons wrenched from their grip and clattering uselessly against the stone. Helmets turning in every direction with the particular panic of people who have just discovered that the thing they came to threaten was never actually the one in danger. "Nobody's hurt," Juno said quickly, scanning each of the 4 suspended figures, relief cutting through the fear when she confirmed it: held, restrained, frightened, but whole. "It's not killing them. It's just holding." Holding, the same word it had used for her 4 days ago when she'd asked it to spare the fleet. She understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, exactly what was happening. The machine had reached, in this one moment of true threat, for the gentlest tool in an arsenal built to end a war, because some small remaining piece of what its makers had originally intended it to be, buried under 11,000 years of weapon, still remembered the difference between an enemy and a frightened soldier following bad orders. "Please," she said to the machine, to the light, to whatever vast patient intention was listening through her own nervous system right now. "Let them go. They were wrong to come here, wrong to threaten you, wrong to threaten me, but they're not the war you were built for. That war's over. It's been over for 11,000 years. Please let them go." For a long moment, nothing changed. The 4 bands of light held steady, the 4 soldiers hung suspended and silent, and Juno felt, more clearly than she had felt anything since the operating table, the full weight of the choice sitting in front of her. Not the soldier's fate, though that mattered plenty, but her own. She could feel at the edge of her own thoughts the shape of what the choir was offering her in this exact instant, the same offer Sale had warned her about, the same offer that had apparently ended every warden who came before her. It would give her anything she reached for right now. Vengeance for the ambush. Permanent removal of every threat Dreeth's faction represented. A command so absolute that no council anywhere would ever again dare treat her like a liability instead of what she actually was. She thought of her grandmother's face on the recording, of "Don't let it decide for you," and understood, finally, standing in a drowned chamber with 4 frightened strangers suspended in her mercy, and an 11,000-year-old weapon waiting to hear what she wanted most, that the real test had never been whether the choir would recognize her. It was whether she would recognize herself, in the one moment that actually mattered, as someone who didn't need it to give her anything at all. "Let them go," she said again, quiet now, certain. "Not because they've earned it, because I don't want to be the kind of warden who needs a weapon to tell her that's the right thing to do." The light released them. All 4 soldiers dropped, ungracefully, to the stone floor, weapons still scattered out of reach, and none of them moved for a long moment beyond the ragged sound of breathing filtered through helmet speakers. Juno crossed to the nearest of them, the one who'd fired, and knelt, careful, unarmed, and pulled the helmet's release before the soldier could stop her, revealing a face younger than she'd expected. Ondine, barely past whatever their equivalent of 20 was, eyes wide with a fear that had nothing performative left in it. "Go home," Juno said. "Tell Dreeth exactly what you saw down here. Tell him it held its fire when it had every justification not to, and tell him that's not the profile of a weapon that needs to be destroyed. It's the profile of one that's finally being asked, for the first time in 11,000 years, to be something other than a weapon." She stood, offered a hand the soldier didn't take, and didn't push it. And tell him if he sends anyone else down here with a gun, I might not be steady enough to ask nicely a second time. The pendant at her throat, as if in answer, pulsed once, warm and slow, and she'd have sworn it, though she never found a way to say it aloud that didn't sound absurd, satisfied. Thesson's own shuttle reached the landing terrace 11 minutes later, engines still hot from an emergency launch that had, according to Vehent, broken at least 4 separate transit safety regulations on the way down. Juno heard them before she saw them, Daishi's voice, raw and furious and relieved all at once, calling her name across the drowned platform before the shuttle's ramp had fully lowered. And then he was there, pulling her into an embrace hard enough to hurt the stitches, and she didn't care in the slightest, held on just as hard, breathing him in like proof the last hour had actually ended. I woke up and you were just gone, he said into her hair, voice cracking on the last word. I thought, Juno, I thought. I'm here, she said. I'm okay. Daishi, I'm okay. Vehent came down the ramp a step behind him, already scanning her with the small handheld unit. He seemed to carry everywhere now, professional worry doing the work. His face was clearly too relieved to manage on its own. And behind both of them, last off the shuttle, Thesson, helmet under one arm, expression somewhere between fury and something that looked, on a face built for neither, almost like shame. Dreath soldiers, he said. The 4 who took you, are they alive? Juno said. Shaken. One of them fired on the choir directly, Marshal, pointed a weapon at 11,000 years of buried grief and pulled the trigger, and it didn't kill a single one of them. It just held them until I asked it to stop. Thesson absorbed that for a long moment, and Juno watched something shift behind his eyes, not relief exactly, but the particular recalibration of a man who had spent his entire career assuming that overwhelming force answered overwhelming force, encountering, for the first time, hard evidence to the contrary. Dreath's finished, he said finally. Compact Council doesn't survive a counselor ordering an armed abduction and an unauthorized incursion into a live weapons site, not once the full telemetry's reviewed. I'll have him in formal custody within the hour, and I intend to make certain every remaining council member understands exactly whose restraint kept this from becoming a massacre tonight. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the Compact's. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, there wasn't a trace of wariness left in it. It was yours. It wasn't just mine, Juno said, glancing back at the shaft behind her, at the faint cyan glow still rising steady and slow from 200 meters down. I asked. It's the one that actually chose mercy. I just gave it a reason to. That, Sale's voice said, patched through from the archive annex, arriving in the middle of the conversation with the particular breathless urgency of a man who'd been listening the entire time and could no longer hold his silence, is, if I may, child, precisely the point. 11,000 years of my people's oldest records call this thing a weapon because that is the last thing it ever did before it went silent. But records are written by survivors describing endings, not by anyone who was present for what it was meant to be before the war twisted it into that shape. I have thought, since the moment you first held fire on those cruisers, that you have not been reactivating a weapon these past 5 days, Ms. Vashti. I think you have been the first hand in 11,000 years patient enough to let it finally become what its makers actually built it for, before the war took that choice away from all of them. Juno stood on the drowned landing terrace, the pendant warm and steady at her throat, Daishi's hand still gripping hers, Vehent's scanner still humming quietly against her side, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsteady since the moment a scalpel drone opened her side 5 days ago. Not certainty, not yet, but the first real outline of it, the shape of a question she finally understood how to answer. Then let's find out, she said, what it actually wants to be. She went back down alone this time, insisted on it, over every objection Vehent, Daishi, and even Thesson tried to raise, until Farah, patched in from orbit, made the final call in Juno's favor on the simple grounds that whatever was about to happen in that chamber had never once, in 5 days, responded well to an audience of frightened people with guns. Hint monitored from the shuttle. Daisy waited on the terrace, arms folded, jaw set, the way he'd waited every single time she'd gone under black water for 4 years running, and it steadied her more than she expected to walk down that shaft one more time knowing he'd be exactly there when she came back up. The chamber was quiet when she reached it, not the held breath quiet of a threat still deciding, but something calmer, something that felt, for the first time since the operating table, almost like peace. The ring of names glowed soft and steady underfoot. The vast dark shape at the center pulsed slow, and even, patient in the old way again, not the sharp bracing patience of 5 minutes before a soldier pulled a trigger, but the deep, unhurried patience of something that had, perhaps, just remembered what waiting used to feel like before it had a reason to be afraid of it. Juno crossed the floor of names and placed both hands flat against the alloy, warm under her palms, and closed her eyes. And for the first time in 5 days, she stopped bracing for whatever it might ask of her, and simply listened. What came to her in the stillness of the chamber was not words at first. It was memory that wasn't hers, vast and slow, and utterly unlike the sharp, disordered rush of human recollection. More like standing at the edge of something too large to see all at once, and being shown, patiently, one small piece at a time. She saw, felt, understood, in whatever sense a human nervous system could hold something built for a different kind of mind entirely, the last hours of the war that had built this place. Not battle, not fire. Just exhaustion, absolute and total, 2 civilizations who had forgotten, somewhere in the long grinding length of it, what they had originally been fighting to protect. She felt the makers of the choir standing in this same chamber, or one like it, deciding between 2 unbearable choices: destroy the weapon and lose forever any hope of ever again defending what little was left of their people, or seal it imperfectly, and trust some distant, unimaginable future to find a hand steady enough to finish what they couldn't. She felt their fear. She felt, underneath the fear, something that surprised her more than anything else in 5 extraordinary days: hope. Not for themselves. They had known by then they wouldn't survive to see it answered. Hope for whoever came after. And she felt, at the very center of all of it, the choir's own oldest purpose, buried so deep under 11 millennia of weapon that even its makers had nearly forgotten they'd built it this way at all. Not to end wars. To end the need for them. A guardian meant to stand at a threshold and make violence unnecessary simply by being present, only twisted by desperation, in the war's final grinding years, into something that ended threats instead of preventing them. Because ending was faster, and by then, faster was all anyone had left to give. Juno opened her eyes, hands still flat against warm alloy, and found she was crying, quiet and unhurried, in the vast drowned quiet of the chamber. "I understand what you want," she said, out loud, steady despite the tears. "You don't want a war. You never really did, not underneath all of it. You want to stand at the door and make sure nobody has to fight one again. That's not a weapon's job. That's a guardian's job, and you've been carrying both for so long you forgot there was a difference." The pulse under her palms slowed, deepened, and the pressure behind her ribs that she'd learned over 5 days to recognize as the shape of its attention gathered itself, patient and enormous, into something that felt, for the first time, less like a question and more like an answer arriving. "So here's what I'm asking," Juno said. "Not commanding, asking, the way my grandmother told me to, the way I should have started 5 days ago instead of demanding you hold or stand down like you were a machine I was operating instead of something that's been waiting 11,000 years to be understood. I'm asking you to stand at the door. Watch. Protect, if it's ever truly needed, but never again decide on your own that ending is faster than preventing. And I'm asking you to let that decision, every single time, be a decision we make together, not one you make for me, and not one I make without you. That's the only kind of warden I know how to be. The kind that doesn't hand this over to a machine and doesn't take it for herself either. The kind that shares the weight. The chamber's light didn't flare this time. It settled every pillar, every carved name, every vein of cyan in the vast dark alloy under her hands, dimming by careful degrees into something softer, steadier. A low, patient glow that felt, for the first time since the operating table 5 days ago, less like a held breath and more like an exhale that had finally been allowed to finish. And then, quiet as the water overhead, quiet as her own pulse, the words came, not the deep tectonic weight of the first time it had spoken, but something gentler almost, if a weapon 11,000 years old could manage such a thing, almost warm. Warden of the Vanter Choir, the door is yours to keep. We will wait together for as long as it takes. Juno stood in the drowned chamber with both hands against a machine that had just, in its own ancient and patient way, agreed to become something other than what a desperate war had made it, and let herself, finally, simply breathe. She surfaced to a landing terrace crowded with more people than it had ever held at once, Daisy first, always first, catching her before her knees quite remembered how to hold her weight after everything the chamber had just poured through her. Vihint close behind, scanner forgotten in his hand, watching her face instead of her vitals for the first time since she'd known him. Thesson at the edge of the platform, arms still folded, but something loosened in his shoulders that hadn't been there an hour ago. And Sale's projection, flickering at the terrace's edge, 3 eyes, even the clouded one wide with an old man's unguarded wonder. It spoke, Sale said, before she'd even finished crossing the platform. The resonance spike, the pattern shift, Ms. Vashti, the entire grid just settled into a stable low-power configuration for the first time in recorded history. Whatever happened down there. It agreed to be a guardian instead of a weapon, Juno said, and found, saying it out loud in the ordinary daylight-pale glow of the terrace lights, that the sentence carried less weight than she'd expected and more relief than she'd thought herself capable of feeling after 5 days like the ones just passed. It's not sleeping again. It's just watching, waiting the way it's good at, except now it's waiting for a reason instead of out of habit, and it's not doing it alone anymore. Meaning? Thesson asked, careful, the wariness not entirely gone but folded now into something closer to respect. Meaning I'm not walking away from this, Marshal, Juno said. I can't, even if I wanted to. The graph's permanent. Vihint's told me that much twice now, and honestly, 5 days ago I might have hated hearing it, but I don't hate it anymore. Meaning if the Compact wants a functioning line of communication with the most dangerous weapon system in this system, one that's chosen, on its own, to hold fire twice now, when every readout you own says it had every justification to do the opposite, you're going to need someone who understands it well enough to keep asking it the right questions instead of giving it the wrong orders. I'd rather that someone be answerable to people with rules, with oversight, with a council that can call her in front of it and ask hard questions, not some closed-fist arrangement where one warden decides everything alone in a drowned room and nobody else gets a vote. She looked at him steadily. I want a formal accord, Marshal, written down, reviewed, my role defined by more than just an accident of blood and bad luck. If the Compact wants a warden it can trust, it needs to be a warden it can also check. Thesson studied her for a long moment, and something that might, on a harder face, have been the beginning of respect settled into the line of his mouth. I'll draft the framework myself, he said, personally. And I'll make certain Dreeth's replacement on the council understands exactly why restraint bought this outcome and force very nearly bought a massacre. It took the better part of 2 months to formalize. Compact accords moved, Juno learned, at roughly the speed of drowned continents, which was to say glacially, with committees and counter-committees and one memorable session where Sale was called to testify for 11 consecutive hours about a bloodline theory. He'd spent 40 years defending to an audience that had finally, at long last, run out of reasons to dismiss him. Dreeth stood before a compact tribunal and lost his seat, his rank, and Juno heard later, without much satisfaction in it. Most of his remaining allies, who had discovered, in the wake of a nearly catastrophic unauthorized incursion, that association with him carried more risk than his faction's fear had ever been worth. She didn't celebrate his fall. She understood, in a way she suspected only someone who'd stood 11,000 years of a weapons-patient grief in her own chest could understand, that Dreeth's fear hadn't been irrational. It had simply been answered wrong. Halyard's salvage, for its part, quietly and with visible relief, dissolved Juno's contract rather than argue with the compact over jurisdiction, and paid out, to everyone's mild surprise, a severance generous enough to suggest someone high up the corporate chain understood exactly how much worse this could have gone for the company's reputation if they'd fought it. Juno didn't mourn the job. She'd loved diving, loved the particular quiet focus of moving through drowned architecture no one had touched in centuries. But 4 years of scrap contracting had never once made her feel the way she felt now, standing at the edge of something that mattered in a way she was only beginning to understand the shape of. Day she took a position with the new Vanter Accord office, the compact stood up to manage the fortress's changed status, half surveying the safe, now quiet upper ruins for the archive sale was building, half, Juno suspected, simply refusing to be anywhere she wasn't for longer than a shift allowed. She didn't mind. Some fears, she'd decided, 5 days in an operating theater and a drowned chamber had earned the right to keep for a while yet. V. Hent stayed on as her attending physician officially, and as something closer to a permanent friend unofficially, monitoring the graft site with a diligence that had never once, in 2 months, wavered into complacency, and confessing, one evening on the terrace with 2 mugs of the bitter Ondine tea Juno had slowly, stubbornly, learned to like, that watching her walk back into that chamber alone had been the single most frightening moment of his professional life, weapon or no weapon. "You could have died down there," he said, "and I'd have had to explain to an entire council that I let you go alone because I trusted a hunch." "You didn't trust a hunch," Juno said. "You trusted me. There's a difference, and I noticed it, even if you were too polite to say so out loud at the time." He didn't argue that. He just refilled her mug, and the two of them sat quiet for a while, watching the faint cyan glow rise steady and patient through 200 meters of black water, no longer a held breath, no longer a threat waiting to happen, just a light, keeping watch, the way its makers had always meant it to. She went home once, in the 3rd month, back to the small colony world where the Vashti family had lived quietly for 6 generations, without ever fully understanding what they were carrying, to stand at her grandmother's grave for the first time since the funeral and tell her, out loud, everything the recording hadn't lived long enough to ask. The grave sat on a low hill above the harbor town where Odalise had spent the last 30 years of her life, ordinary in every visible way, a modest stone, a name, 2 dates, nothing to mark the 11,000 years of history quietly folded into the woman buried beneath it. Juno knelt in the grass with the pendant warm at her throat, the same pendant that had waited in a drawer for 4 years while she dove wrecks for scrap money, and found she didn't quite know where to start. "I found it," she said finally. "The old road. Turns out it wasn't just a saying. There's a fortress, Grandma, at the bottom of an ocean on a world I'd never even heard of before 4 months ago. And there's a weapon under it that isn't really a weapon anymore. Not since I got done arguing with it. And there's a whole bloodline of people going back further than anyone's written history who spent 11,000 years running, so nobody could ever hold that thing in one closed fist again." She pressed her palm flat against the cool stone, the way she'd pressed it against warm alloy 200 kilometers under black water, and let herself, for the first time since the operating table, simply grieve, not the fear, not the danger, but the plain, ordinary loss of a grandmother who had carried this alone for 60 years and never once had anyone to tell. "You were right, by the way, about not letting it decide for me. It tried a little in the worst moment, not because it's evil, just because it's old and tired, and it forgot for 11,000 years that wanting things badly doesn't make them right to take. I didn't let it. I think that's the only reason I'm alive, to be telling you this at all. The wind off the harbor moved through the grass, ordinary and warm and entirely unremarkable, and Juno sat with it for a long while before she stood, brushed the grass from her knees, and touched the pendant once more, not out of habit this time, but out of something closer to gratitude, before she turned and walked back down the hill to the transport that would carry her home to a drowned fortress on a world 4 systems away, where a guardian 11,000 years in the making was still learning, patient day by patient day, what it meant to keep a door instead of end a war. The compact accord was signed on a gray, ordinary morning 8 months after a scalpel drone first opened Juno Vashti's side in an operating theater she still, on quiet nights, sometimes dreamed about, not with fear anymore, just the particular strange nostalgia of remembering the exact hour her whole life turned a corner she never saw coming. The ceremony was small by design. Juno had insisted on that too. No grand unveiling, no press relay to 100 systems, nothing that turned 11,000 years of grief and patience into a spectacle for anyone who hadn't earned the right to understand it. Just Farah, Thesson, Sale, a handful of council members who'd learned over 8 long months of hearings to listen before they voted, and the people who'd actually been there for all of it, Daishi, Vehent, and patched through by request from the drowned chamber itself. A slow, steady pulse of cyan light on every monitor in the room, keeping time with her own heartbeat the way it had since the very first night. Afterward, when the last delegate had signed off and the room had mostly emptied, Farah found her by the window, looking down at the pale curve of Karst Vanter's cloud layer, and asked her, gently, the question Juno had known was coming since the first day in the recovery ward. "Do you regret it? Touching that wall?" Juno thought about the gantry coming down, the warmth of the fragment against her ribs, the operating table, the drowned hall, her grandmother's recording, the 4 soldiers she'd chosen to spare, the light settling into something patient instead of desperate for the first time in 11,000 years. She thought about who she'd been 4 years ago, diving wrecks for a paycheck, and who she was now, standing at a window with a weapon's whole long grief folded quietly into her own nervous system, keeping watch beside her instead of her. "No," she said, and meant it completely. "I think I was always going to end up finding that door, one way or another. I just didn't know, until I did, that the whole point was never to open it alone." Below the station, 200 kilometers down, in a chamber no war had touched in 11,000 years, the choir kept its slow, patient watch, not sleeping, not hunting, simply present, the way its makers had always meant it to be. At the door it had finally, after all that long silence, learned to keep with someone standing beside it instead of ahead of it. And somewhere in that light, in the low and steady hum that had become, over 8 months, less like a warning and more like a heartbeat she'd grown to trust, Juno Vashti carried the weight her grandmother had warned her about, and the peace her grandmother had never lived to see. Both at once, both hers, both, finally, understood. The peace didn't last as long as anyone would have liked, though it lasted in the end, exactly long enough for Juno to understand that keeping a door was never going to be a single decision made once and then finished. It was going to be a life's work, made in small pieces, over and over, for as long as she held the pendant at her throat. 6 weeks after the Accord's ink dried, Sale's deep survey teams turned up a second complex on the far side of Karst Vanter's drowned continent. Smaller than the fortress ring, older even by some readings, a scatter of 11 pylons the original survey charts had marked, like the first, as dead coastal defense and nothing more. Nobody had thought to check it twice, not with the main grid finally stable and the compact council mostly satisfied that the danger, whatever it had been, was contained. That was precisely the gap a salvage crew calling itself the Undertow Concern had been counting on. Juno got the call from Thesson at an hour that told her, before he'd said a word, exactly how bad it was. "Unlicensed extraction vessel," he said, voice tight, already patched through to her from a defense compact cruiser burning hard toward the site. "They've cut into the outer casing of at least 3 pylons before our patrol picked up the resonance spike. If they hit a control node the way your fragment got hit, they'll wake something with no idea what they're touching and no bloodline key to calm it down when it panics," Juno finished, already moving, already pulling on boots with one hand while she held the comm with the other. "Get me a fast transport. Now." The Undertow Concern's crew, it turned out, were not soldiers, not ideologues, not anyone's hired extremists. Just 4 independent scrappers who had heard, through channels Thesson would spend the next month trying to trace and plug, that a working precursor weapon fragment had fetched an almost unbelievable black market price from at least 2 buyers with more money than sense, and had gone looking for a second payday nobody in the compact had thought to guard. Juno reached the site to find them mid-extraction on the 11th pylon, cutting torches already through the outer casing. 3 of the crew arguing in raised voices over a readout that had, in the last 10 minutes, gone from quiet to increasingly, alarmingly unstable. She didn't come in with weapons or compact escort at her back this time. She came in alone, in a borrowed dive suit, moving through water she knew better than any of them, and found the crew's lead, a rangy, sun-weathered woman named Priska Dahln, who looked up at Juno's approach with the particular defiance of someone who'd survived worse standoffs than this one. "You're the warden," Priska said, not a question-cutting torch still lit in one gloved hand. "Word travels. Figured you'd show up eventually if we dug deep enough." "You cut into a live node," Juno said, not bothering with introductions, keeping her voice level despite the readout climbing steadily behind Priska's shoulder. "It's not going to react the way you're hoping. It's going to react like something that's spent 11,000 years learning that a torch through its casing means the war started again. You have maybe 90 seconds before it decides your whole crew is a threat, and I am the only person within 400 kilometers who has any chance of talking it back down once that happens." "So talk it down," Priska said, "and we'll take our cut and go." "No," Juno said, simple and final. "You don't get a cut. You get to live, if you drop the torch right now and get your people clear of the casing. That's the whole offer, and it's not up for negotiation, because the alternative isn't me being tough with you. It's a weapons system deciding, on its own, in the next 60 seconds, exactly how it wants to handle 4 strangers cutting it open with no idea what they're holding." Priska's eyes flicked to the readout, to the faint tremor already visible in the water around the pylon's base, and whatever calculation ran behind her weathered face, it landed at last on the side of caution. She killed the torch. "Clear the site," she said to her crew already moving. "Now. Everybody out." They made it clear with 11 seconds to spare, by Juno's own count, standing at the edge of the disturbed water with one hand pressed flat against the nearest intact pylon, speaking low and steady in the register she'd learned over 8 months. The choir answered best to not command, not plea, just plain honest reassurance, the same words she'd have used on a frightened dive partner 300 meters under black water. Not a threat, just strangers careless already leaving. No war here. Just me asking you to hold. It held. By the time Thesson's cruiser reached the site, the 11th pylon's tremor had settled back into its old patient stillness. The Undertow Concern's crew was in compact custody facing charges that would keep them out of any drowned ruin for a long time to come, and Juno was sitting on the hull of her own borrowed transport, soaked and shaking with adrenaline finally catching up to her, when Daishi's voice came over the comm, tight with the particular fear of a man who'd learned, 8 months ago, exactly how fast his life could change in the time it took to answer a call. "You're okay." "I'm okay," Juno said, and found, saying it, that she believed it more completely than she had at any point in the last 8 months. It's a lot of watching, Daishi. 11,000 years worth. I don't think it ever really ends. No, he agreed, quiet. I don't imagine it does. Come home anyway. I'll have the tea ready. She did. The letter from Sale's expanded archive project reached her on an otherwise unremarkable morning 9 months after the accord, forwarded through 3 layers of compact clearance with a note attached in the old archivist's careful, old-fashioned hand. Ms. Vashti, I believe you will want to read this yourself before anyone else does. It was a survey report from a compact outpost 4 systems away, filed by a junior researcher who had, almost by accident, cross-referenced an obscure genetic marker flagged in Sale's now widely circulated Warden line research against a routine colonial health archive, and found a match, not on a human world. On a Threll settlement, among a species Juno had encountered exactly once, briefly, in that strange volunteer test 7 months ago, when a long-limbed engineer had held a choir fragment and dropped it, muttering about static, and nobody in the room had thought to look closer. The match wasn't the engineer, it was his sister. Juno made the trip herself, over Thessen's mild objection and Daishi's considerably less mild one, because some decisions, she'd learned by now, needed to be made in person or not made honestly at all. She found the sister, a quiet, sharp-eyed young Threll named Is Vantorel, barely past what her species counted as adulthood, working an unglamorous maintenance contract on an orbital relay station and entirely unaware, until Juno's transport requested docking clearance, that her family carried any history stranger than 3 generations of relay technicians. You're saying, Is said, for the 3rd time, sitting across a cramped mess hall table from a human stranger who had just calmly explained that she might be distantly, impossibly related to a bloodline 11,000 years old, that somewhere back in my family there's an ancestor who ran from the same weapon you're telling me you're currently friends with. Not friends exactly, Juno said. Partners, maybe colleagues. I don't have a perfect word for it yet, but yes. The scattering wasn't just human, Is. Whoever built the choir spread that bloodline as wide and as far as they could reach, across every species and every ship they had access to on purpose, so no single closed fist could ever hold the whole key again. My family carried a piece of it, so it looks like does yours. Is was quiet for a long moment, turning a mug of something bitter and steaming between both hands, and when she finally spoke, there was less fear in her voice than Juno had braced for, and something closer instead, to the same stubborn curiosity Juno remembered feeling herself, standing in an operating theater with a stranger's hands inside her own spine. Does it hurt? Is asked. Being what you are now. Sometimes, Juno admitted. It's a lot of weight, and it doesn't come with an instruction manual, and about once every few months something happens that reminds me exactly how badly it could all still go wrong. But it's also, she considered the word carefully, because Is deserved the honest version, not the easy one. It's also the first time in my whole life I've felt like the thing I'm carrying actually matters to something bigger than just me. I don't know if that's a fair trade for what it costs. I know I wouldn't give it back if you offered. I don't have the fragment, Is said. I don't think. Nobody's ever tested me. You don't have to be tested, Juno said. You don't owe the compact your blood just because a researcher found a marker in an old file. That's your choice, Is, all the way down, and I'd rather you make it slow and clear-eyed than fast and frightened. But if you ever do want to know, if the question ever gets loud enough that you can't set it down, you come find me. I'll go with you. Nobody should have to walk into that chamber not knowing whether the thing on the other side of it is going to want something from them, or just want to be understood. She left us with an open invitation, a calm frequency, and quietly, without making a production of it, a promise she intended to keep for as long as it took, because Sale's research, once fully unspooled, would eventually find perhaps a dozen more scattered threads of that same ancient bloodline, across 3 more species and half a dozen worlds. And Juno understood, standing on that relay station's observation deck watching a young stranger absorb the strangest morning of her life. That the last house had never really been about one closed fist after all. It had been about exactly this, a door, kept open, wide enough for whoever eventually needed to walk through it, on their own time, in their own way, never alone. 10 months after the Accord, the trouble that finally tested everything Juno had built came from somewhere no one on the Compact Council had thought to watch. It began as a single anomalous contact at the edge of the system, a ship of a design no Compact registry recognized, broadcasting nothing, running dark on every channel Theson's outer picket tried, until it dropped out of transit 30,000 kilometers from Karst Vanter, and simply sat there, patient and silent, for 6 full hours before it finally spoke. "They call themselves the Ash Remnant," Sale told her, voice unsteady in a way Juno had never heard from the old archivist before, patched through to the small transport carrying her out to meet Theson's assembling response fleet. "I have spent the last 6 hours cross-referencing every fragment of the oldest strata I possess, and I believe, I am not certain, but I believe, they are descendants of the other side. The civilization the choir's makers fought, not gone extinct after all, Ms. Vashti. Simply scattered, the same as the Wardens were, and apparently far better at finding their way back." The Ash Remnant's opening transmission, when it finally came, was addressed not to the Compact, not to Theson's fleet, but to Juno directly, by a title that made the hair on her arms rise. "Voice of the Vanter line, we have come to finish what your ancestors began." Their demand was simple and absolute. The choir fully surrendered, its bloodline key severed by any means necessary, delivered into Ash Remnant custody within 1 day. Or, the transmission promised, with a flat, unhurried certainty that chilled Juno more than any threat Dreath's soldiers had ever managed, they would finish the war themselves, from orbit, with a fleet 3 times the size of anything Theson could muster on short notice. "They're not bluffing," Theson said, grim, studying the sensor returns from the bridge of his flagship while Juno stood beside him, pendant burning warm and urgent at her throat, the choir's own attention. She could feel it now, distant but unmistakable, like a held breath 200 kilometers below, already gathering itself toward something it hadn't reached for in 11,000 years. 4 capital-scale vessels, weapon signatures I don't have a match for in any database we hold. If they're even half as old as that grid down there, Vashti, we are not winning this by force." "We're not winning it by force at all," Juno said, and found, saying it, that some very old, very patient part of her, the part that had spent 10 months learning to listen before it spoke, already understood exactly what the next move needed to be. "Get me a direct channel, not to their fleet, to their commander. I want to talk to whoever's actually making this decision, before either side does something 11,000 years can't undo a second time." The Ash Remnant's commander answered the channel herself, a lean, weathered woman of a species Juno had never encountered before, pale-skinned, dark-eyed, unmistakably watching her with the same raw, complicated intensity Juno imagined she must have worn herself, the day Sale first called her Vanter Warden across an archive table. Her name, translated awkwardly by Juno's implant, came through as something close to Kest Ilharan, first voice of the Remnant fleet. "You are young," Kest said, without preamble, studying Juno through the relay with an expression that held more grief in it than hostility. "Younger than any of the ones who bound it the first time. I did not expect that. I expected a soldier, or a fanatic, or a puppet the Compact was using to hide behind a weapon too dangerous to touch directly. I did not expect a girl with fear still in her voice." "I've got plenty of fear in my voice," Juno admitted. "I've had it there since the day I woke up on an operating table with this thing already in my spine. But I'm still the one talking to you, Kest, not a fleet, not a weapon. And I'd like you to actually hear what I'm about to say before 4 capital ships decide the last 11,000 years didn't teach either of our peoples anything." "Speak then." The choir isn't a weapon anymore. It hasn't been, not fully, not the way your ancestors and mine last saw it, since the day I asked it to stop being one. It held fire on a compact fleet that entered its old engagement envelope by accident. It held 4 armed soldiers suspended and unharmed after one of them fired directly into its housing. I have spent 10 months teaching it, patiently, one decision at a time, the difference between ending a threat and simply standing at the door, and I am telling you now, as the only living voice it currently answers to, that if your fleet opens fire on this system, you will not be finishing an old war. You will be starting a new one, against a guardian that has finally, after 11,000 years, remembered what it was actually built to protect. I don't think that's a fight your people want, Kest. I don't think it's a fight anyone still living actually wants. I think what your people want, the same as what set my own bloodline running 11,000 years ago, is to finally stop being afraid of that door. The relay held silent for a long moment, Kest Ilharen's dark eyes fixed on Juno's face with an intensity that made the distance between their two ships feel, briefly, like no distance at all. My grandmother's grandmother told me stories, Kest said finally, quiet now, some of the flat command gone out of her voice. Of a weapon that ended everything her people loved, wielded by a bloodline that vanished into the dark rather than face what they had helped unleash. We have hunted that story for 11,000 years, first voice, not for vengeance, though I will admit some among my fleet still carry that, for an ending, for proof that the thing which broke our world could never again be turned loose on it. She was quiet another moment. You are offering me something else. A door, kept instead of a weapon, feared. I do not know if my fleet will accept that difference easily. I do not know if I fully do. Then come see it yourself, Juno said. Not your fleet. You. Come down to the chamber unarmed and stand where I stood and let it show you what it showed me, not a war-ending Kest. A war that never should have had to happen at all, and a guardian that spent 11,000 years wishing, in whatever way a machine that old can wish for anything, that it had been given the chance to stop it before it started instead of ending it after. If you still want your fleet to open fire after that, I won't stop you trying. But I don't think you will. Kest Ilharen came down alone, 3 hours later, over the visible objection of her own command staff, escorted only by Juno and, at a careful distance, Hent, monitoring both their vitals with the particular grim focus of a man who had learned, the hard way, exactly how badly a chamber visit could go. The Ash Remnant commander said little on the descent, said less crossing the ring of names, and when she finally placed her bare hand against the alloy beside Juno's, the choir's response was neither violence nor rejection, but the same slow, patient unspooling of memory it had once shown Juno herself. The last hours of the old war, the exhaustion, the grief, the hope its makers had carried for a future neither side of that ancient conflict had lived to see. Kest wept, silent and unguarded, for a long time before she spoke again. They wanted this to end, she said finally, voice raw. Both sides. None of our records ever carried that, only the ending itself. Never the wanting, underneath it, to have never needed one. She looked at Juno, and something in her weathered face had changed, some old certainty finally laid down. I will take this back to my fleet, first voice. I will tell them what I felt down here. I cannot promise every one of them will hear it the way I did. Old grief does not always listen to new evidence. But I will try, and I believe, having stood here, that trying is the only honest answer left to give. The Ash Remnant fleet withdrew 4 days later, quietly, without further threat, leaving behind only a single small vessel and a standing offer, relayed through Kest, and eventually formalized over the following months, into the first tentative accord between the compact and a civilization neither had known still existed. To open, slowly, carefully, a channel neither side had believed possible 11,000 years ago. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the first honest conversation either bloodline's descendants had managed since the war that built the door Juno now stood watch over. Thesson called it the single largest diplomatic outcome of his career. Achieved, he said afterward, dry enough that Juno nearly missed the compliment inside it, by a scrap diver who talked her way through a first-contact standoff, instead of firing a single shot. The formal signing, when it finally happened, took place not in some grand compact hall, but on the drowned landing terrace itself, at Juno's own insistence, because she had learned by then that anything decided about the choir carried more honesty when it was decided within sight of the water that hid it. Kest Ilharin returned for the occasion, this time with two of her own command staff rather than a fleet at her back, and stood beside Thesson and Feyre, and a visibly moved sail as the first formal accord between the compact and the ash remnant was read aloud, translated 3 times over for 3 different sets of ears, and signed under a sky the color of old iron. It did not solve everything. Juno was careful, in the small remarks she gave afterward, brief, unpolished, delivered because Feyre insisted someone needed to speak for the choir itself, and there was no one else left who could to say so plainly. 11,000 years of grief did not unwind in 4 days, or 4 months, or possibly even 4 generations. Old certainties, the kind that had sent a fleet across half a mapped galaxy chasing a story about a weapon and a vanished bloodline, did not simply dissolve because one commander wept in a drowned chamber and came home changed. There would be factions on both sides, Kest had warned her privately, who read this accord as capitulation rather than courage, and Juno had no illusions that the small vessel the remnant fleet had left behind wouldn't, on some future day, need to answer hard questions of its own. But it was a beginning, and Juno had come, over 10 months of learning to be whatever a warden actually was, to trust beginnings more than she trusted grand declarations of permanent peace. Peace wasn't a document. It was a door, kept open day after day, by people willing to keep choosing it. You did something today no fleet in either of our histories managed in 11,000 years, Kest told her quietly, before the remnant shuttle lifted for its return to orbit. I don't know if my people have a word for what you are. We will need to find one, I think, now that we know your kind still exists. Warden works fine, Juno said. It's the word my own people finally found for it, and it took us 11,000 years to earn the right to use it honestly. I figure your people can take their time too. Kest almost smiled at that, the first almost smile Juno had seen from her, and boarded her shuttle. And the sky over Karst Vanter's cloud layer, for the first time in 11,000 years, held 2 civilizations that had once tried to erase each other entirely, standing on the same drowned terrace, neither one reaching for a weapon. Daisy found her afterward, sitting alone at the terrace's edge with her boots dangling toward black water the way she had the very first week, the pendant quiet and steady at her throat, and settled beside her without a word for a long while. The way he'd learned over 10 months was usually the kindest thing he could offer. Big day, he said eventually. Biggest one since the operating table, probably, Juno agreed. Feels strange to say that out loud. A year ago my biggest decision most days was whether a support strut was going to hold my weight for one more dive. Now I'm apparently averting wars. You're still the same person who used to check struts twice before trusting them, Daisy said. That's not nothing, Juno. I think it's actually the whole reason any of this worked. You never once stopped checking twice, not with the choir, not with Dreith's people, not with Kest today. Everybody else in every room you've walked into for the last year has been reaching for the fastest answer available. You're the only one who kept asking whether fast was actually right. She leaned into his shoulder, tired in the good way now, the way that came after a long dive well finished rather than a disaster narrowly survived, and let the quiet stretch between them, the cyan glow rising faint and patient through the black water below, the sky beginning, at last, to soften toward evening. I used to think keeping this door was going to be the hardest part, she said. Turns out that's not it at all. The door's easy, once you actually listen to what's on the other side of it. The hard part's everything standing around the door, deciding what they're going to do about it. I don't think that part ever gets easy. I think you just get better at standing in it. Then it's a good thing, Daisy said. You've had a whole year of practice. Is Vantoro called 2 weeks after the treaty signing, her voice smaller over the comm than Juno remembered from the relay station, but steadier too, the particular steadiness of someone who had spent a long time turning a hard question over in her hands before finally setting it down in the shape she wanted. I want to test it, Is said without preamble. The marker. I've thought about it every day since you left, and I keep coming back to the same thing you told me, that I shouldn't decide out of fear, and I shouldn't decide out of curiosity either, not really. I think I want to decide, because if it turns out I'm one of you, one of the scattered ones, I'd rather know how to help carry it than spend the rest of my life wondering whether I could have. Juno went to her this time, rather than asking her to travel. Some decisions, she'd learned, deserved to happen on the asking party's own ground, and stood beside Is in a small compact medical bay while a technician drew the sample that would confirm what Sales cross-reference had already strongly suggested. It came back positive within the hour, a marker fainter than Juno's own, diluted by generations further removed from the original scattering, but unmistakably genetically the same old thread. So what happens now? Is asked, staring at the readout with an expression Juno recognized completely, having worn something close to it herself on an operating table just over a year ago. Now you get to decide what kind of warden you want to be, if you ever decide to be one at all, Juno said. There's no fragment waiting in your spine, Is. You're not bonded, not the way I am, and you don't have to be, ever, if that's not the life you want. But the choir recognizes bloodline the way a compass recognizes north, whether or not the compass ever leaves the drawer. If you want to learn what that means slowly on your own terms, I'll teach you everything I've learned the hard way, so you never have to learn it the way I did, alone, on a table, with no idea what was happening to you. Is was quiet for a while, turning the readout over in her hands the way she'd turned the mug of bitter tea a year and a half ago, and when she finally looked up, there was something new in her face, not fear, not quite excitement either, but a kind of resolve Juno recognized as the exact shape of her own, the day she'd first told the Compact Council, I want to go to the source. Teach me, Is said, slowly, on my own terms. But teach me. It became, over the following months, the shape of a small and unexpected new life. Juno traveling between Karst Vanter and Is's relay station every few weeks, walking a stranger who had become, gradually, and without either of them quite marking the exact day it happened, something like family through the same hard lessons Sales records and the choir's own patient memory had taught her. Is never bonded a fragment of her own. The Compact Council, chastened by the near catastrophe of Dreeth's ambition, agreed unanimously that no second interface should ever be forced or even lightly encouraged, and Is herself, in the end, chose a quieter role, an advisor, a second voice in the growing archive of Wardenline descendant Sales research kept turning up across the mapped worlds, someone who understood the weight of the bloodline without carrying the full charge of it herself. You didn't have to do this alone, Is told her once, months into their strange new friendship, sitting together on the same drowned terrace where Juno had once stood facing down Dreeth's soldiers. I don't just mean me, I mean all of it. The council, the remnant, the whole impossible year of it. You could have kept the whole weight to yourself, and told yourself that was the responsible thing to do. I thought about it, Juno admitted, especially early on before I understood what the choir actually was. It would have been simpler in a way, one warden, one door, no one else to worry about losing. She looked out at the black water, at the faint cyan glow that no longer felt, after all this time, like anything to fear. But my grandmother spent 60 years carrying this alone, and it nearly broke her, in quiet ways I didn't understand until I read between the lines of everything she never told me. I decided pretty early on I wasn't going to make the same choice she did, not because she was wrong to protect me, but because I think what actually protects a door in the end isn't one person standing in front of it. It's everyone who's willing to stand near it, taking turns, so nobody has to hold the whole weight alone for 60 years and call it love. Is didn't have an answer for that, not right away, but she reached over and took Juno's hand, the same unspoken gesture Daishi had offered 100 times over the past year, and the two of them sat together in the fading light, watching the water, until the sky over Karstvanter's cloud layer finally settled into evening. Salvaren finished his life's work in the same season the Ash Remnant Treaty was signed, a full accounting, decades in the making and finally, impossibly, complete, of everything the Compact's oldest strata could tell about the war that built Karstvanter's fortress, the bloodline that had run from it, and the long silence that followed. He asked Juno to be present when he sealed the archive's final entry, and she stood beside him in the annex he'd built with his own careful hands, watching a man well past what his species usually considered old age look, for a moment, genuinely young again. 40 years I chased this, he told her, voice thick. 40 years of colleagues who thought I was chasing folklore, of funding committees who thought my work a waste of compact resources better spent elsewhere. I used to lie awake wondering if I would die with the question still unanswered, whether the Warden line was real, whether the choir was more than a coastal defense grid gathering rust at the bottom of an ocean nobody cared to dive twice. He looked at her, 3 eyes bright, the clouded one no less alive than the other two. You didn't just answer my question, child. You let me live long enough to watch the answer become something that mattered to more than just an old archivist's stubborn pride. You did the actual work, Sale, Juno said. I just happened to be standing in the right hallway with a torn suit and bad luck. You're the one who spent 40 years making sure somebody would know what to do with me once I got there. He didn't argue that, though she suspected, watching him settle back into his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man closing a book he'd spent a lifetime writing, that he didn't fully believe it either, that some part of him understood, the way she was only beginning to, that the two of them had built this together, an old man's patient decades and a young woman's stubborn nerve, meeting in a drowned chamber neither could have reached alone. Vihent's role changed too in the 2 years that followed, from senior reconstructive to something the Compact Council eventually formalized as Warden's physician, a standing appointment that made him, in practice, half doctor and half diplomat, forever explaining to visiting dignitaries and nervous new researchers exactly what did and did not constitute a medical emergency where an 11,000-year-old weapons system was concerned. He complained about the paperwork more than he complained about anything else, which Juno had learned, over 2 years of friendship, was his particular way of admitting he loved the work more than he was willing to say outright. I used to think the hardest thing I'd ever do in this career was tell a patient's family we couldn't save them, he told her once, on one of their now regular evenings on the terrace, watching the cyan glow rise steady through black water gone, at last, entirely familiar. Turns out the hardest thing was watching you walk back into that shaft alone with 4 soldiers levitating behind you, and realizing there was nothing left for me to do but trust you'd come back up. I always came back up, Juno said. You did, Vihent agreed, every single time. I'm still getting used to trusting that as a pattern instead of a lucky streak. Thesson, for his part, retired his marshal's rank 18 months into the new accord, not out of failure but out of a quieter, harder one understanding that the Compact's relationship with the choir, and now, tentatively, with the Ash Remnant, needed a different kind of steward than a soldier trained to answer threat with force. He took a seat on the newly formed Warden Oversight Council instead, the body Juno had insisted on from the very first week, the one that meant no single warden, present or future, would ever again carry that weight without people who could ask her hard questions and mean it. I spent my whole career believing overwhelming force was the only honest answer to overwhelming risk, he told the council at his final formal address as Marshal, Juno seated in the gallery beside Daishi, listening. I was wrong about that, in ways I am not too proud to say out loud. The single greatest defense this system has ever possessed did not come from a fleet, or a weapon, or a show of strength. It came from one frightened young woman who kept asking, over and over, whether the fast answer was actually the right one, and who never once stopped listening long enough to find out. He looked up, found Juno's eyes across the gallery, and inclined his head, the same small, precise gesture he'd once used to surrender to Farah on the day they met. I intend to spend whatever years I have left making sure this compact never again mistakes patience for weakness. It is, I have come to understand, very often the harder and the braver of the two. Priska Daln, of all people, sent word not long after Thessen's retirement address. A short, terse message routed through the compact's rehabilitation office, where the Undertow Concern's crew had spent the better part of 2 years working off their sentence in supervised salvage contracts, far less lucrative, and far more closely watched than anything they'd attempted at Karstvanter. She wanted, the message said, no pardon, no shortcut, nothing she hadn't earned the hard way, only a chance, once her contract term ended, to apply for honest work on one of the licensed survey crews now mapping the fortress's outer ruins under Sale's supervision. Juno approved it herself, over the mild surprise of the review board, on the simple grounds that a woman who had dropped a lit torch the instant she understood what was actually at stake had shown, in that single unglamorous moment, more genuine judgment than plenty of people who'd never been tested at all. You're a soft touch, Daishi told her not unkindly when she mentioned it that evening. I'm a diver who got a second chance nobody was obligated to give me, Juno said. Seems dishonest to pretend I don't know what that's worth, just because the shoe's on the other foot now. The 2-year anniversary itself arrived with less ceremony than the occasion might have warranted. A small gathering on the drowned terrace, Farah and Vihent and Thessen and Sale and Daishi. Is down from her relay station for the week, even Kest Ilharan present by careful, hard-won invitation, sharing a meal that mixed 3 species idea of a proper table and somehow, against every reasonable expectation 2 years ago, managed to feel like exactly that. Nobody made speeches. Nobody needed to. They ate and talked, and watched the light fade off Karstvanter's cloud layer, and eventually, one by one, said their good nights and left Juno alone on the terrace the way she'd asked, quietly, for them too. That was when she went down to the water's edge, sat, and let herself simply remember the gantry falling, the operating table, the hum in her hip that had once terrified her and now felt, after everything, like the steadiest part of who she'd become. 2 years, almost to the day, after a scalpel drone first opened her side in an Ondine operating theater, Juno stood once more on the drowned landing terrace above the Vanter Choir's chamber, alone this time by choice, watching the pale wash of Karstvanter's cloud layer catch the system's distant sun. The fortress around her had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable the day she first touched a seam in a wall that wasn't supposed to be there. A small, careful research annex built into the upper ruins under Sale's patient direction. A rotating detail of compact observers who had, over 2 long years, learned to treat the site with something closer to reverence than fear. And threaded quietly through all of it, the low, patient hum of 41 pylons keeping their long watch. No longer holding a breath, simply breathing. She thought of the long road her family had walked without ever fully understanding it. A grandmother who had worn a piece of this weight for 60 quiet years. A mother and a mother before her, all the way back to a scattering nobody living had witnessed, and all of it arriving, in the end, at an ordinary diving accident that had turned out not to be an accident at all, but a door finally, patiently, found. She thought, standing there, of her grandmother, of a note tucked into a box on an 18th birthday, of a recording made in the cargo hold of a ship on the old road generations, before Juno was ever born. She thought of the operating table, of Vehent's steady hands and Theson's hard, necessary questions, of Daisy waiting on this exact platform every single time she'd gone under, and of a weapon that had spent 11,000 years forgetting, and finally remembering, the difference between ending a threat and simply standing in its way. The pendant at her throat pulsed once, warm and slow, and somewhere far below, in a chamber lit by patient cyan light, something ancient and enormous and finally at peace kept its long watch beside her, not because it had to. Because, after 11,000 years of silence, it had chosen, the same way she had, to keep the door together instead of alone. Juno Vashti closed her eyes, felt the wind off water that no longer hid a held breath, and understood at last exactly what her grandmother had meant. Somewhere out past the cloud layer, a compact fleet and a remnant vessel kept an uneasy, hopeful distance from each other, learning slowly to share a sky. Somewhere on a relay station 4 systems away, a young Threll woman was falling asleep with a readout on her nightstand that had changed the whole shape of who she understood herself to be. Somewhere on a colony world she hadn't visited in over a year, a modest stone marked a grave that had finally, after everything, stopped feeling like an unanswered question. And somewhere very near, close enough to touch, a man who had waited on this exact platform more nights than either of them had ever bothered to count was walking back toward her with 2 mugs of bitter tea, unhurried, unafraid, exactly on time. She was not the last house any longer, not the way her grandmother had been, alone with a pendant and a warning and no one left to share the weight. She was the first house of something new, a door with more than one hand on it now, a bloodline no longer scattered to survive but gathered, carefully on purpose, to endure. That, she had come to understand, was the actual inheritance, the one no ancient record had thought to write down because no single warden before her had lived long enough in the keeping to learn it. That a door held alone eventually breaks the hand that holds it, and a door held together simply, patiently, stays open. Some inheritances aren't a weight you carry. They're a door you learn in time to keep.